Ways of Witches. Vampire Dead-tective Book 3. Written by Flynn. Chapter 1. I stood there bent over the sink, the picture of defenselessness. My head was shoved under the running faucet, and my hair was soaked. Beside me on the counter lay the object of my desire, the shampoo. I blindly reached for the soapy goodness, and my hand bumped into the plastic container. It clattered to the ground and a swear passed my lips. "Goddamn this damn sink," I muttered. This was part of my daily routine. I would awaken late in the afternoon and wash my hair or try to. The task wasn't easy when the sink was the size of a pail, and you were naturally a little clumsy. I pulled my head out of the sink and looked through my wet mop of hair for the AWOL bottle. The fleeing culprit had fled across the linoleum and wood floors, and paused near the coffin table. With my head bent down, and a distinct sway in my gait, I shuffled over to the coffin and snatched the bottle from the floor. Behind me was a trail of wet drops from the ends of my hairs. I knocked loudly on the coffin and leaned close to the lid. "You'd better be grateful for me washing my head in the sink," I shouted. I would have felt bad, but it was almost night and time for him to get up. Besides, it was true. I avoided using the bathroom, so I wouldn't touch his sensitive side, namely the soul in the clear bottle hidden in the medicine cabinet. "I will thank you when you no longer disturb my rest," Vincent shot back. "Maybe you need to get in touch with your sensitive side a little more often. It might do us both some good," I countered. "It is not as simple as that," he argued. I noticed the drops of water from my hair, and grinned evilly. I leaned over the top of the coffin where his head lay, and listened to the drip 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 of the water as it hit the hollow wood of his bed lid. Vince's voice replied in an even, tense tone. "Is the sun gone?" I glanced out the window. "It's pretty much ack." Vincent flung up the lid, and it collided with the side of my face. I stumbled back and titled my head backwards, till my Medusa strands fell about my shoulders. My free hand clutched at my throbbing ear, and I glared at the vampire who sat up in the coffin. "This is the thanks I get for cleaning your coffin lid?" I garbled through my hand. "That is the thanks you deserve for disturbing my sleep." Again, he countered. Vince lifted one foot out, and my devious mind forced me to toss the smooth plastic shampoo container beneath his foot. His shoe made impact on the round tube, and his leg kicked into the air as the container rolled out from beneath him. He landed with a hard plop back into his coffin. His head hit the bottom, and he lay there for a moment stunned. I burst into a wild cackle of victory. My breaths came out in sharp gasps as I looked on Vince's wide eyes and his mouth slightly ajar. "Going wheeze back to wheeze bed," I choked out. Our little ruckus happened a couple of days after our last adventure with the death cult of Astaroth, and was sure signs that cabin fever had set in. The only cure was to get ourselves into more trouble, and it came knocking on the door just as Vince rose from his coffin to commit murder-suicide. Knock knock rang the sound on our ancient weathered door. We both turned our heads to the entrance, and I glanced back at Vince. "You order a hooker?" I asked him. He dutifully ignored my comment, and dove one hand into his pants. Out popped the dark glasses, and in a moment they covered his red eyes. "Answer it," he ordered me. I snorted. "Why should I answer the door?" "You're dressed too," I argued. "Because, as you duly noted last time, I am not the face of our business," he countered. I wrapped one finger around one of my wet, limp strands of hair. Even terrifying as I was, his face was rather ghastly in its paleness, so I answered the door in all my wet hair glory. I swung open the entrance, and found an old man with a cane on the other side. He wore a wrinkled brown suit that matched his wrinkly face, and on his head was a brown bowler. The little old man peered at me through bottled glasses, and I have to admit, I took a little bit of delight when he started back. "What the hell have you done to yourself?" the man asked me. That was not the voice of an old man. I tilted my head to one side and blinked at our guest. "Mitch," I guessed. He snorted and pushed past me into the room. Who else? He counted. A hooker, I suggested. No, but you'll wish it was when you find out my bill, he told me. He pulled off his wrinkly mask and hat, and looked to Vince. You were wanting to know more about Ruthven, and his making trouble still, right? I'd hate to think I went all this way downtown for nothing. Vince raised an eyebrow but nodded. I am. We are, I corrected him. Well, I happened to learn that he had some dealings with her. Which? Vince finished for him. Mitch frowned. That's right, but how'd you know? Astaroth provided us with some information. What else can you tell us about Hilda? Vince asked him. Mitch chuckled. He probably told you and then tried to kill you, right? Yeah, death by Japanese porn, I told him. Just his style, which is to say he doesn't have much of one. Anyway, I got a little more than he does, but because you know the first part, I'll give this half off. The witch he was talking about is dead now, and if my info's right, which it always is, she was a good friend of Tim's. He wagged his eyebrows at Vince. I'm right? Yes, but where and why was she killed? Vince persisted. Mitch shrugged. She was killed at her hut outside town. I'm not quite sure about your second question, except that I heard it was about a spell book. There's plenty of those on the market now, so I don't know why Ruthven would throw a fuss over another one. At the mention of a spell book, Vince's pale face grew paler. He tore off his glasses and paced the floor between his coffin and the couch. Mitch and I watched in curious fascination for a few moments, until Mitch coughed. I'm going out on a limb here, but I'm guessing you know what I'm talking about. Vince paused in his pacing, and pulled a wad of bills from his other pocket. He held them out to Mitch. I trust this will cover your fee. Mitch's eyes flickered between the roll and Vince's face, but he didn't take the money. I'd pay you that much if you tell me what you know. There is only the money or nothing. Take it or leave, Vince ordered him. Mitch frowned but snatched the roll from Vince's hand. You sure don't help a friend out much, do you? I may when I find one. Now leave, Vince replied. The vampire resumed his pacing, and ignored the two of us still present in the room. Mitch donned his mask and faced the door. He strode up to me and nodded back at Vince. His voice was so low even I could barely hear the words. Make sure he doesn't get himself killed. Because he likes you so much. I teased. He snorted. No, because he's my best paying customer. He plopped his bowler hat on his head, tipped it at me with a winning wrinkly smile, and closed the door behind himself as he left. I turned my attention to Vince. He had stopped his pacing, and now looked out the window. I don't know why he bothered. The city was too bright to see the stars and the view was of the next decrepit brick building over. I walked up to him and stood by his side. Mind telling me what this is about? I asked him. Tire treads, he commented. I blinked at him. Is the tire in your mind a little low on air? What does that have to do with anything? He half turned to me and looked over his glasses at me. When we fetched the car, the tire treads had mud on them. I shrugged. So Tim took it out for who? You're thinking that maybe Tim went to see this witch at her house before he died, and there might be a clue there we can find. A ghost of a smile passed over his lips. You may yet become a decent detective. I snorted. You mean Dead-tective, don't you? Anyway, when do we leave? Right now. Just let me finish washing my hair. No, now. My shoulders slumped forward, and I dragged my fingers through my hair. Fine, right now. Chapter 2. Vince was gracious enough to let me comb my hair with a proper comb, but the shampoo was not to be. 10 minutes later found us in the old Deathmobile on our way to someplace. The slummy streets with their trash piled high between buildings made way for the suburbs. On either side of us neat identical houses lined brightly lit streets, and cars sat on the curbs without fear of being robbed of their tires. Far ahead of the road lay a small hill covered in wild growth, the last outpost of natural land within 10 miles.
Where did this witch live?
I asked him. In a shack at the outskirts of the city, he replied. And was she really a witch, or was she just a witch with a B instead of a W? I wondered. Witches exist in the world, and she was one of them, he assured me.
So can they curse people and stuff?
It is called hexing, and they can. So we should be worried about being turned into a frog? Well, if she was alive, that is.
Witches don't waste their energies on minor insults. So you're telling me you're a witch?
I teased. Vince yanked the car for a hard left, and my shoulder slammed into my door. Will you watch it? I'm not made of steel like you, you know. You are nearly as durable as I, he countered. I rubbed my bruised shoulder. Yeah, real durable, like an inflatable toy at a cat shelter. Anyway, should we be worried about any booby traps or roommates or something? I mean, we always have trouble with whatever we do. There may be protection spells remaining around the cabin, but Ruthven's men may have disabled most of them in their effort to murder her, he pointed out. Lovely. So how well did Tim know this witch? Would he really have told her something that we need to know? I asked him.
That is what we need to find out, he replied.
The road changed from well-paved to maybe paved at one point in its history. The car bumped through potholes the size of Vince's coffin, and hopped over humps that made Officer Romero look small. The fine houses with their manicured lawns were replaced by older, run-down frame houses with empty windows and weed-choked lawns. Dead trees hung their long skeletal branches over the road, and rusted cars without tires sat on the lawns and on the dirt that made up the curbs.
This city sure is rotting, I whispered more to myself than my partner.
Ruthven's influence, he commented. I turned to him with an appraised eyebrow, and nodded at the haunted houses.
What's Ruthven got to do with this?
I noticed Vince's hands tightened on the wheel. Ruthven has long had his hands on the city's pulse. He squeezes the life from every living thing, until there remains only a dried corpse. I shuddered when I remembered the look in Ruthven's eyes as he tried to convince me to come with him.
So he's in more than just the supernatural part of town?
Yes. I leaned back and scrutinized my partner.
Not to go too far off topic, but you're pretty chatty tonight.
You asked to be more informed. I have given you information, Vince told me. I leaned toward him and narrowed my eyes.
Where's my partner?
That grumpy old vampire who wanted to kill me this morning? Vince stiffened. It will not help me to have an ignorant woman at my heels. I snorted.
That never stopped you before.
I glanced out the window, and watched the apocalyptic scenery fly by. You know, for everything Ruthven's done, I think his goons are a lot worse than he is. I mean, they're the ones actually doing the bad stuff and… Vince slammed his foot on the brake and cranked the wheel to the right. The car slid to a stop beside a rusted hulk of an automobile, in front of a house that resembled the home from Psycho. I wrapped my fingers around the dash until we came to a full and complete stop, and then I whipped my face to Vince to glare at him. I take it back, you're still the same old vampire. You're still trying to kill us both. Vince leaned back in his seat and stared straight ahead. His lips were pursed together, but his hands slid into his lap. Ruthven is a monster. Never forget that. I held up the ring that bound us to each other.
Aren't we monsters too?
Being bound to a vampire, and being a vampire, isn't exactly natural. Ruthven is different. He has no remorse, no sympathy, no.
You just described yourself, I interjected.
Vince started, and there was such a look of shock in his wide eyes that I regretted my words. I looked away from him, and out the window. I'm sorry, I really shouldn't have said that. Vince's reply was to pull the car back onto the street, and drive us up the hill with the small forest. I risked a glance at him and saw his jaw was stiff, and his lips were set in a thin line.
Really, Vince, I didn't mean…
I heard your apology the first time, he interrupted. His voice was as cold as the time we had the conversation in the warehouse, after which he tried to kill me. The rest of the drive was tense and quiet. I looked to him from time to time, but he only watched the road. The old houses on either side of the road gave way to a forest full of half-dead, darkened trees. Their rotting roots slid into the road, and we bumped over them with all the grace of a hippo overpacking peanuts, but without all the enjoyment of watching the bubbles burst. Brambles and rotting leaves covered the space between the leaning trunks, and the warm glow of the streetlights vanished. Only the headlights from the car provided us light on this overcast night. The city disappeared behind us, and still we climbed the meandering road up the hill. The path narrowed so that branches occasionally scraped the side of the car, and sometimes the wheels slipped on the muddy ground beneath the tires. The mud reminded me of the telltale signs of mud we found on the car, and Vince's assumptions about Tim's visit before his death. At tense times like these I missed him the most, and not just because he would have been in my place doing these terrifying adventures. He was a good friend who went before his I guess he was really old, but he went before I could say my goodbyes to him. My silent reverie was interrupted by a noise ahead of us. It was the howl of a wolf. Vince stopped the car and quickly shut off the headlights, engulfing us in near total darkness. I leaned over the dashboard and peered into the blackness in front of the car. My gifts from Vince allowed me to see down the road, but I heard and saw no more.
You think that was a wild dog?
I whispered to Vince. No. Didn't think so. What now? Now we walk. He stepped out of the car, and I hurried after him. Dead is the only way I'd be caught alone on a spooky hill like this. Vince silently stepped up the hill, while I trudged along behind him as best I could. His legs were longer, and his grace allowed him to move like a cat through the thick mud and weeds that choked the road. I lumbered behind him like a moose through a porcelain factory, but somehow we managed to make it to a final turn up the road. Another howl alerted us to trouble, and Vince grabbed one of my shoulders and dragged me behind a nearby tree. He peeked around the tree in the corner, and I followed suit. Around the corner was the end of the road. There was a small clearing, with a decrepit log cabin built on a rock foundation that wasn't so much crumbling as turning to dust. A leaning porch and chink between the logs accentuated the aged look of the place. Gnarled trees lay 10 feet around the cabin, and the moss from the limbs hung over the building like a dark veil. Nothing moved or made a sound, but I noticed the door was ajar. The slightest breeze caused it to creak on its rusted hinges. The 2 small square windows at the front showed there was no light inside. Its owner was dead, and it would now be all but forgotten, as it turned to a pile of rotten boards and piles of rocks. There came another howl, and the sound was so close I started, and nearly slipped into the mud. The noise came from just on the other side of the cabin, and it was quickly followed by the high-pitched scream of a woman. In a moment, a woman of 35 in a cloak and dress raced around one of the rear corners of the cabin. Her wild pants filled the hair and her hood flapped behind her. She looked over her shoulder, and a second later I saw what so frightened her. A half-dozen werewolves skidded around the muddy corner, and followed close at her heels. Their teeth gnashed together, and their claws were outstretched to snatch her. She didn't watch where she ran, and one of her feet slipped on a large pile of mud. The woman fell face first to the ground. The werewolves barreled down on her. I couldn't stand by and watch her be ripped to shreds. I tried to jump out from behind the tree, but Vince grabbed my arm and held me still. It was a good thing, because the woman rolled over onto her rear, and pointed both her palms at the oncoming werewolves. A burst of bright green light flew from her palms, and slammed into her attackers as they were in mid-leap. They flew through the light and came out as cabbages. The greens rained down on the woman, and pelted her with their vegetable evilness. The woman stood and brushed the cabbages and mud off her.
"Blast the wrong spell again," I heard her mutter.
I turned to Vince, and nodded at the woman.
"Is she a—" Another howl interrupted my question.
The woman stiffened, but only for a moment. She turned and flung herself down the hill towards us, in a mad dash to escape her new pursuers. I stood a little on the outside of the tree, so I was visible to her as she approached. I tried to slip behind the tree, but the only slipping happened beneath my feet. My clumsy feet slipped on the mud, and I fell onto the road where my side sunk into the gooey mess. The woman noticed me when she was 10 yards off, and she slid to a stop. She yelped and held her hands out in front of her as before. I slammed shut my eyes and prepared for a life as a vegan, in the most literal sense. A bright light shone through my eyelids, but before it could hit me a shadow threw itself in front of the light's path. I opened my eyes in time to see Vince take the shot in the back. His glasses slid down, and I could see his eyes were wide in shock and pain. He fell forward, and I grabbed his shoulders to keep him from falling face first into me. There came another howl, and the woman rushed past us and down the road. In a moment she was out of sight, and more howls warned me the werewolves would soon be in sight. Unfortunately, I had a heavy problem on my hands with my partner. Vince lay stiff in my arms and one of his hands clutched at his chest. He breathed with such rapidity that I wondered if his non-working lungs would burst. "You okay?" I asked him. He let out a terrible wheeze, and his body shook with a tremor that made me vibrate. "I'll take that as a no, but you have to get up or we'll be puppy chow." Vince struggled to his feet. I slung one of his arms across my shoulders, and even through our clothes I could feel how flush he was with fever. "I didn't know vampires could get a fever," I commented. More howls told me I was wasting time, so I dragged Vince down the hill away from trouble. Chapter 3. Vince struggled to take even one step, and more often than not I found the mud more useful than his legs. He slid along most of the way. My eyesight didn't help matters. Up the hill I'd been able to see perfectly, but now I found the darkness of night somehow clouded my vision. I tripped and stumbled over rocks and roots, and by the time we reached the car a minute later my energy felt sapped. I pushed him into the passenger seat, and took the driver's chair. The headlights provided much-needed light, and I spun the wheel and slammed my foot on the gas pedal. Well, I tried. The pedal was like lead, with a sticky spring beneath it. It took most of my energy to inch the car forward in a long curve, so we faced downhill. Gravity helped us along, and the car rolled down the hill to the brightly lit city below us. I now had time to look at my ailing partner, who sat slumped in the seat beside me. He lay against the door, and his right hand still clutched his chest over his heart. His face was twisted into a grimace of agony. "You okay?" I asked him. He shook his head. "Anything I can do?" Another shake of the head. "Is there anything anybody can do?" He nodded.
"Bat?" he hoarsely whispered.
I frowned.
"You want a bat?"
"You can turn into a bat." "Bartholomew," he rephrased. "Oh. Bat." I faced forward and pressed harder on the gas pedal. It moved down about 1/4 of an inch.
"We'll be there in a sec."
I paused and turned toward Vince.
How do I get there?"
Vince raised his left hand, the one with the ring, and pointed his ring finger at the windshield. A small, weak glow erupted from the ring like a tiny dome. It flickered and wavered as though fighting against a breeze. A slim beam of light flew out from the front of the dome, and stretched through the windshield and 10 yards in front of the car where it ended in a fine point. The beam pointed a little to the left.
"Follow the line," he choked out.
I lifted my own ring hand, and glanced between his ring and mine.
"What can't these things do?"
I asked him. Vince winced as though a pain shot through him, and the light from his ring flickered. He dropped his ring hand, and the glow disappeared completely. My guide was gone.
"Vince, I really need that light."
He turned his face away from me and said nothing. "Come on, Vince. We can't get to bats without it." His breathing evened, and the hand that clutched his chest slipped down into his lap. "Vince." By now we were off the hill, and in the rundown portion of the city. I pressed on the brake, and pulled the car to the side of the road. I scooted across the seat and looked at his face. His skin had a strange color to it, more pink and less pasty white. His eyes were closed, and his body lay limp against the door. I grabbed my partner's shoulders and gave him a rough shake. Come on, Vince, this isn't funny. I shouted at him. No response, not even a flicker of his eyelids. I leaned back and my eyes caught sight of his ring. I raised my own ring to my eyes and I glanced between the two cursed trinkets. Vince sat in the background of my view, sick and helpless. My eyebrows crashed down, and I scooted back into my own seat. I raised my left hand and pointed my ring finger at the windshield. If Vince could do it, then so could I. I focused all my thoughts on willing the guiding light, but there wasn't even a flicker of brilliance from the ring. I clutched the ring against my chest and tried to tamp down the tears of fear and frustration that welled up in my eyes. My eyes flickered to my pale and unconscious partner. I closed my eyes and clasped the ring in my other hand as I made a quiet prayer.
Please, Tim.
I need to help Vince, I whispered. A small flicker of light ignited my hope. I looked down at my ring and saw a small wavering dome erupt over the dark jewel. My face broke out in a grin, and I stretched out my left hand toward the windshield. The familiar stream of light shot through the glass and across the bow of the vehicle toward the slummy depths of the city. I pulled the car onto the road and followed the light. My weakened foot meant we putted down the streets, but a half hour later we arrived at the garage door. The car entrance raised on our coming, and we coasted into Tim's garage. I hopped out and raced through the white door into Bat's main experiment quarters. Bat! I shouted. Bat! The old man himself shuffled from the enclosed white room. His bleary eyes told me he'd been asleep. Liz. What's the matter? Where's Vince? I rushed over to him and grabbed his hand.
There's something wrong with Vince.
He collapsed, and now I can't get him to wake up. Collapsed? At night? Bat mused.
No time.
I dragged Bat into the garage and over to the passenger side of the car. Bat opened the door and leaned in. He stepped back, and one look of the deep frown on his face made me shudder. We must get him to the couch, Bat told me. I'll carry him, I offered. If I could easily move manhole covers, then a man would be no problem. I slipped past Bat and leaned into the car. One tug of Vince's body told me I couldn't move him. I can't carry him, I told Bat. Bat's frown deepened. Interesting, but let us both carry him, he suggested. With our combined strengths, we dragged him out of the car, through the lab and into the white room to plop him on the couch. Our plop must have been hard because he gasped and clutched at his chest. His eyes squeezed tightly shut and he stiffened. Bat leaned over him and inspected Vince's face and hands.
What exactly happened? He asked me.
We were going to some witch's shack to find out if Tim left anything there before he got killed. When we got there was this woman being chased by a bunch of werewolves. She turned them into cabbages and ran down the road toward us. She saw me and I guess tried to turn me into a cabbage too, but Vince jumped in the way and took the shot. Bat turned to me and raised an eyebrow. Did he? And what then? I nodded at my partner.
Then he clutched his chest like he's doing now, and told me to get him here.
Bat returned his attention to Vince and grasped Vince's hand. He started back but didn't lose his hold. My God, he's warm.
Yeah, I thought he might have a fever, I told him.
A fever may be the least of our worries, Bat replied. He gave a few yanks on Vince's hand, but the vampire refused to move his hand.
Why's he clutching it so hard?
I asked Bat.
The heart is a very important organ for a vampire.
It's the only one when, if damaged, Vincent let go. Bat managed to pry Vince's right hand off his chest, but Vince grasped his left hand near the same spot. It's the only organ that, if damaged, will destroy him. Aha! Bat managed to loosen the grasp of Vince's left hand, and he held them away from Vince's chest. The vampire squirmed, but his efforts were weak and futile. So all the horror movies are right about the stake? I guessed. He nodded, and wiped some sweat from his brow with the use of his shirt.
That's correct, but if you could hold his hands away from his chest I would be most grateful.
Sure thing. I moved to stand behind his head, grabbed Vince's hands and clasped them together over his head. It was surprisingly easy, given how much stronger he should have been than me, his being the older undeadish creature. Vince thrashed and his eyes opened. They were a strange blue color, and they glared at me without his usual demonic glower. He seemed not to recognize me, but rather to be in a semi-conscious state where the survival instinct. I lay partially against him to keep him from squirming. "Bat, there's something seriously wrong with Vince," I told our friend. "One moment," Bat replied. He leaned down and pressed his ear to Vince's chest for a moment. He pulled away with a quick start, and his eyes were wide as he stared down at Vince. "My God," he murmured. "He'd better not be," I quipped. Bat turned to me with those wide, unblinking eyes, and I noticed his hands that lay on the couch beside Vince shook.
"He has a heartbeat."
Chapter 4. I stiffened and blinked at him. Below me Vince stopped his futile struggles and his arms fell limp in mine.
"He has a what?"
I asked Bat. "Vincent has a heartbeat," he repeated. I looked to Vince and back to Bat, then did a double take and nodded at the vampire.
"He's dead. He can't have a heartbeat."
"Undead, but that state seems to have changed," Bat told me. Being undead is kind of a permanent condition," I argued. Bat rubbed his chin and looked to Vince.
"It seems there may be a way to reverse the effects of undeath."
"One moment." He hurried from the room, and the door banged shut behind him. I turned my attention to my invalid partner. Vince's eyes were scrunched shut and his breathing was still harsh. Bat's comment was ridiculous. Vampires couldn't become human, or at least I thought they couldn't, but I had to admit Vince showed all the signs of being human. His skin had color, he breathed in and out with alarming regularity, and he was warm to the touch. The change to a mortal also explained why I was able to hold his hands away from his chest. Vince's hands trembled in mine, and I gave them a squeeze. I was surprised when he opened his pretty new eyes and I looked down at him.
"How you feeling?"
I asked him. He shook his head and turned his face away from me. I cringed.
"Not that great, huh?"
"Bat should be." The door swung open and Bat hurried in with a large dusty tome clutched against his chest. Bat went over to us and plopped the tome onto the end table near the couch. He blew on the cover, and a thick layer of dust drifted into the air. A coughing fit interrupted him for a moment, and he covered his mouth with his hand as he leaned over the table. I tried to pull away from Vince to help Bat, but Vince's hands gripped mine. I turned back and his gaze caught mine. His eyes were scared, confused. Bat managed to get a hold of himself, and he flipped open the book to near the end. His finger ran down the page full of archaic handwriting, and strange pictures of herbs and hand-waving like the witch had performed. He stopped halfway down one of the pages and tapped an entry. "Aha! Here it is." "Here what is?" I asked him.
"The answer to our question."
It seems the witch you encountered performed a life spell on Vince, which gave him a sort of false or second soul. The soul arose inside him, and uncorrupted by his vampirism, because it wasn't present during his initiation into his undeath, revived his body.
"Wait, so is this a good thing or a bad thing?"
I wondered. Bat turned his attention to Vince, who had again closed his eyes.
"That would depend on the vampire."
For Vincent, I believe the change has been rather abrupt and a shock to his system. Vince shuddered, but he ground his teeth together and gained control over his body. He tilted his head toward Bat, and his voice was hoarse and weary. "I will be fine," he argued. Bat snorted. "You haven't been fine for countless centuries, and you haven't had your soul for well over a century. Having all those emotions and bodily demands beyond hunger must be a little vexing." "Is it temporary?" I asked him. He pursed his lips and shrugged. "I can't say. That depends on the caster of the magic, and it's hard to guess the strength without knowing the witch." "So what do we do?" My stomach suddenly gurgled so loudly the noise echoed off the walls of the room. I cringed as the growl rang through my hollow stomach. "What the hell? I'm suddenly hungry." Bat scrutinized my face and raised an eyebrow. Interesting. Because of your connection to Vincent, the spell has been passed on to you. You are both no longer undead, but living. My mouth dropped open. Then this means
that the curse no longer applies?
The only way would be to remove the ring, Bat suggested. I had to try this. I had to know if I was finally free of this accursed life. I had to get my hand free of Vince's grasp. Even as a human, he still had a strong hold on my fingers. I tugged, but he didn't give. Come on, Vince, you know you want me to try. Wouldn't it be great to get rid of me? I argued. Vince frowned, but he opened his hands and I was free. I stepped back and took a deep breath. A second chance at a normal life. My mind's eye flashed with the possibilities of enjoying food again, or going out shopping, or even getting a new job. Well, maybe not that last part, but everything else would be fun. I grabbed the ring and gave a hard yank. Nothing. I gave another, and another. My only reward was raw, rubbed skin on my finger. I dropped my arms to my side and hung my head. No go, I muttered. Bat patted me on the shoulder. There is an advantage to this situation, at least for Vincent, he told me. I snorted and looked up at him.
Is that supposed to make me feel better?
His eyes caught mine and flickered down to Vince, without his moving his head.
It may make him feel better, he hinted.
I followed his gaze, and saw that Vince's blue eyes stared at me without blinking. His arms lay limp over his head, and his body shivered with these new raw emotions and demands. He looked so helpless. A fish out of water in his own body. I could relate. Well, when I was a half-vampire. Now I could feel all the familiar, but forgotten quirks of the human body. There was the stiff muscles, the craving for pickles and yogurt, and the unrelenting demand to go to the bathroom. My cheeks reddened, and I turned to Bat with a sheepish grin on my face. Do you have?
There's a bathroom in the machine shop, Bat told me.
Thanks, I'll be right. I will accompany you, Vince spoke up. He raised himself from the couch and winced. His hand flew to the place over his heart, and he let out a gasp of air.
What is this feeling? That would be your heart pumping blood through your veins, Bat explained.
Vincent scowled, dropped his hand and swung his legs over the side. Living is a nuisance. We must find the counter spell to this hex and lift it. I stalked up to him, and put my hands on his shoulders. All but his hands was as weak as a lamb, and I pinned him to the couch. My eyes met his, and I frowned. If I had to live with being a nearly undead, then you can do this whole living thing. He scowled back at me.
This is not a natural state.
I snorted.
Neither is being undead.
This is a hex cast by an incompetent witch, Vince rephrased. We must reverse the spell before worse side effects occur. Bat raised an eyebrow. Incompetent? Was she? I shrugged but kept my hold on Vince's shoulders, and glanced over my shoulder at Bat.
It looked like she tried to turn werewolves into something, and they changed into cabbages.
Bat stroked his short beard. Very interesting. With such a novice witch, it will be very difficult to tell how strong is the hex without studying the long-term effects. Vincent scowled at Bat.
There is no need for such study.
We merely need to, he grimaced and leaned over his lap.
I need to relieve myself.
I sighed and grabbed his arm. Come on. I'll help you to the bathroom, but I'm not aiming your little fellow for you. I can stand on my own, he insisted. Vince pushed himself onto his feet, but his unsteady legs shook and his knees buckled. I caught him under the arms, and he fell onto me. His weight was too much, and we both fell to the floor with him atop me. My arms and legs flailed beneath him, as I heard Bat chuckle over us.
Stop laughing and help us up.
I growled at him.
There is no need, Vince wheezed.
He managed to slip off me himself, and sit back onto the couch. His hand went to his chest, but he willed himself to set his arm against his side. He steadied his breathing and relaxed.
It seems I will need time to adapt to this weak body, until we can remove the hex.
I snorted. You forgot to mention you're as weak as a baby. That may be, but I will not allow my new weakness to stop me from a simple task such as walking. Vince slowly rose to his feet and locked his legs. He shuffled past us and out the door like Frankenstein's monster. I held in my laughter until he was out of sight, and then burst into a wild cackle. I expected Bat to join in, but he stood silently nearby with his lips tightly pursed together. His expression of concern killed my merriment. You're really worried about him, aren't you? I asked him. He gave a nod. Yes. In our many years of knowing one another, I have never seen him in such a weak position. It's unfamiliar territory for him to be so helpless, and if we find that there is no cure for this hex, then the life he knew may be finished. I cringed. A finished life hit a little too close to home for me.
So what do we do?
Bat turned to me and a small smile slipped onto his lips. He nodded at the ring on my finger.
That still binds you to one another.
Should one of you perish in this weakened condition, then the other still dies. If there is no cure, then you must care for him as well as you are able, and maybe in time he will adjust. I sighed and my shoulders slumped forward. So you're telling me I have to babysit a now human Vince until, or if we get this hex gone? Bat chuckled.
I'm afraid so.
I walked past Bat toward the exit.
All right, but I better not have to teach him how to use toilet paper, I grumbled.
Chapter 5. I walked through the lab and to the bathroom that lay in the garage. The door to the lavatory was located under the stairs, and I found the entrance shut. I knocked on the door.
Vince, you in there?
I called out.
Yes, came his weary voice.
You need any help?
I mean, it's been a long time since you, went the bathroom, I pointed out.
There came a flush, a running of water, and in a moment the door opened. Vince stood unsteadily on his feet, but had enough energy to glare at me.
There is no need for that.
I am not a child. I glanced past him and saw the bathroom was a little dusty, but otherwise clean, and had a toilet and sink. My bladder reminded me that nature called.
Good, then get out and let me have a turn.
I slipped behind him and pushed him out of the room. He stumbled forward but caught himself before he fell. I shut the door and turned to the toilet. Upon closer inspection I saw the seat was up, and he, well more than his physical strength, had vanished with his change to human. I came out a few minutes later, and found Vince leaning wearily against the wall outside the bathroom. You need to learn to aim or you'll never get a human female to room with you, I scolded him. He scowled and slowly pushed himself off the wall. I do not bring my meals home, he countered. I snorted. Well, your meals are now your fellow humans until, or if, we get this spell thing taken care of.
Hex, he replied.
When a witch uses magic on someone, it is called a hex. Oh right. I knew. I paused and shook my head.
No, wait, forget it. There's no way I could have known that.
Vince shuffled past me, and I heard the sound of a grizzly bear emerge from his stomach. I grabbed his wrist and nodded at his noisemaker. You hungry? I guessed. He glanced down at his stomach and frowned.
Yes, but there is no time for food.
There came another loud complaint from his stomach.
Aha! Well, your body is telling you it's time for food, and for humans the hunger isn't all that different from the hunger of a vampire.
It's got to be fed, so we're going to feed it, I told him. I dragged him toward the car. Vince stumbled and struggled after me, but he still hadn't gotten the hang of his weakened body to outmuscle me. Release me, he growled as we rounded the front to the passenger side.
Sure thing, I replied.
I opened the passenger door and swung him inside. He flew chest first into the seat, and I tucked his feet in before I gave him the nickname Stumpy when I slammed the door shut behind him. He sat up and glared at me through the window, and I smiled back and pointed a finger at the ground. Now stay. I walked around the back of the car and saw the door adjoining the garage and lab open, and Bat step inside the garage.
I heard a noise.
Is there a problem? He asked me. I nodded back at the car where Vince scowled at both of us. Vince is hungry, so I thought I'd take him out for some real food, I told him. Bat smiled.
Then I wish you good luck in taking care of Vincent.
He isn't the best patient. I smirked and opened the door.
That's fine, I'm not the best doctor.
I hopped inside and slowly backed the heavy-duty car out of the garage. The last view we had of the garage was Bat waving to us, and then the door closed. I reversed until we hit the abandoned buildings down from Bat's home, and I turned to my partner.
So, where do you want to go?
Someplace expensive. Quaint. Dirt cheap. I wish to be taken to Hawthorne Avenue, he growled. I frowned. That street lay in a part of the slums about 6 blocks from our apartment. Why there? If we are to lift this hex, then we must consult other witches, and many reside there, he explained. I shook my head.
Sleuthing isn't an option yet.
Your body needs food, and if I had to feed on your terms as a human stuck to a vampire, then you have to feed on my terms as a human stuck to another human, I insisted.
How do you expect to pay for this outing of yours? He countered.
This is how. I reached across the short seat between us, and pilfered the roll of bills from inside his coat. His eyes widened and he tried to snatch the money from me, but his reflexes reflected his human status and he missed my hand by a mile. I leaned away from him, and held the roll triumphantly in the air above my head. I grinned at him.
You're too slow, old man.
Vince straightened and turned his face away from me. He gazed out the window and his face fell. His shoulders slumped and he looked weary. Suddenly my triumph wasn't all that triumphant, and I lowered the bills into my lap. Come on, Vince, things aren't that bad, I insisted. He didn't reply. I sighed and glanced down at the money. A bright idea popped into my mind, and I smiled at him. You know, it'll be a lot easier to find a cure to this hex if you eat something. Your body would stop complaining, and we could get some sleuthing done. Vince sighed and looked straight ahead through the windshield.
Lead me where you will.
Perfect. I know just the place I've been dying to eat at. I turned the wheel and punched the gas pedal. We jumped forward and putted down the alleyways between the buildings. Vince sat silently beside me as we meandered our way through the midnight car and pedestrian traffic. The hour was well past when most people usually ate, and I knew the area from my past days as a plain old office girl. That combination allowed me to find prime real estate for parking near my favorite restaurant, the Italian Alley. It was a small establishment, on one of the off-streets to the fashionable restaurant district. The blocky building had large windows on either side of its double-door entrance. Through the windows one could glimpse booths and tables with candles, and menus with more Italian than English. The atmosphere was low-key, the crowds weren't too terrible, and the service was always there to greet you with a smile. I hopped out of the car and around to the sidewalk, but noticed Vince was slow to follow. Actually, he sat like a stone statue in his seat. I frowned at him. Get out or I'm dragging you out. You know I can do that now, I reminded him. His scowl deepened, but he did as I ordered. I grabbed his arm, smiled at him, and led him inside. He blinked against the bright lights and cheery atmosphere. A waiter in a waist apron and black jacket with white shirt came over to us. Duo, he asked us. See, and a dark table grazy, I replied. He swept his hand toward the large dining room, and guided us to a booth seat at the back. I dragged Vince along and leaned toward him. Bet you didn't know I knew some Italian, I teased him. I still do not, he retorted. I was in such a good mood his bad temper couldn't vex me, and I instead laughed at his grumpiness. You can't ruin this meal for me. I'm going to enjoy really eating my meal, instead of chewing and swallowing, or slurping it down a la human neck. We seated ourselves opposite one another in the square booth, and the waiter handed us the menus. I poured over the fettuccine and lasagna, while Vince sat there like a lump on a log staring straight at me. Even with blue eyes, it was unnerving. My eyes glanced over the top of the tall menu, and I narrowed them. "You could try to act normal," I suggested. "I have no familiarity with Italian food," he stiffly replied. I snorted. "You're how old, and you don't know about Italian food?" "A vampire has no taste buds that can detect the flavor of human food," he rephrased. I dropped my menu onto the table and lifted an eyebrow.
"You're joking."
"No." I leaned over the table and looked him in the eye.
"So, when you were a vampire?"
"I still am. Only my body has changed," he insisted. "When you weren't in denial about your species, you really couldn't taste any human food." "That doesn't sound right."
"It should have tasted like something," I insisted.
He stared at me for a moment in thought. "I would describe it as chalk," he finally replied. I grimaced.
"Yum."
I straightened and slid his menu closer to him.
"Well, this stuff definitely doesn't taste like chalk, so pick anything, hell, pick everything on the menu and we'll try it."
"You know what? I'll just do that." I signaled to the waiter, who came over to our table. "I'd like a plate of everything on the menu, and that includes the wine list." The waiter blinked at me. "Everything?" I took out the wad of cash and set it on the table. "Everything?" The waiter's face brightened at the money, and he enthusiastically nodded his head.
"Yes, signorina."
"It shall be done, immediately." He scurried off to obey my command, and I looked to Vince. "Now you'll see what you've been missing these past couple of centuries." Little did I know, I was about to create a monster. Chapter 6. The food was brought in a very timely fashion, with all the pomp a small place like that could offer. There came a half-dozen waiters, half with their arms loaded with trays and the other half with folding legs on which to set the trays. There wasn't enough room on the table for all the food and our plates. They set out the beautiful dishes stacked with food, and plopped a dozen glasses to fill with the variety of wines. With many thanks and open admiration, the waiters bowed and left us to our meal. The parade of food created a big scene in the tiny restaurant, and many of the patrons stared at our table. I smiled and waved at them, and most turned away in embarrassment at being caught staring. Others waved back and returned to their food. I looked to my partner. His eyes were wide and he blinked once. With how rarely he blinked, a single blink told me he was absolutely bewildered. I pushed a plate of spaghetti toward him. "Try this. Everyone likes spaghetti." "I may not," he argued. I rolled my eyes.
"Stop being a baby and try it."
"You'll like it." I watched like a stern mother as he lifted his fork and dug it into the pile of noodles and tomato sauce. He lifted half the plate with his fork, and most of it promptly fell off. Vince scowled at the noodles as though they had committed some blasphemy. I stifled my snort and reached over and stabbed my own fork into the mess. "Like this," I instructed him. I cut off some noodles, then twirled my fork like a ballerina. Then I lifted the utensil and showed off my fine mess of noodles. "See?" Vince frowned but mimicked my moves. In a moment we had twin forks. He lifted it to his mouth, but paused and glared at me over his full fork. "Turn away." I rolled my eyes.
"Oh, come."
"Turn away." I sighed. "Fine." I turned to the window and watched his reflection as he scarfed the whole forkful down and nearly ate the fork with it. He munched a few times and his eyes widened. I looked back to the original and grinned when he chewed and swallowed his mouthful. He stiffened and his hand tightly clasped his fork. "Well." Vince's reply was to stab his fork for another round and eagerly twirl his utensil for an even greater glop of noodles.
"I'll take that as a yes."
Vince scarfed down the plate of spaghetti and gobbled his way through another plate before his overeagerness caught up to him. He paused and his face turned blue. I blinked at him. "You okay?" Vince shook his head and pointed at his throat. He opened his mouth, but I didn't hear any sound or air come out. My eyes widened, and my mouth dropped agape when I realized the food was lodged in his throat. I swept from my seat to his padded bench, grabbed him about the middle and turned him toward the window. I pressed my fists against his sternum, and with a great heave I shoved my hands into his chest. A glob of spaghetti wrapped around a bread roll flew from his mouth and hit the window. I had no idea when he stuffed the roll into his mouth, but the bread glob slid down the window and onto the sill. Vince let out a violent cough that alerted the waiters, and two of them rushed over. "What is it, Signorina? What is the matter?" one of them asked us. I turned to them, and blocked their view of my recovering companion.
"What's the matter is that your food is so delicious. My friend here ate it too fast."
"He's fine now, but I'll have to complain to the cook and give him an extra $50 for trying to choke my friend." The waiters smiled and laughed, and I joined in with a smile. "Then are you needing anything else, Signorina?" they asked me. I shook my head.
"No, but thanks."
They bowed their heads, and left to attend to the other guests. I turned my attention back to Vince. He sat stiffly on his cushioned seat, with his back partially turned to me. I put my hand on his shoulder, and gave it a little shake. "You okay?" I whispered. "I am fine, merely feeling very foolish," he admitted. I sighed and pushed my hip into his side.
"Scoot over."
Vince, too surprised to argue, scooted down, and I joined him on his side of the booth.
"You just need to take it slow.
You know, enjoy every bite and chew it slowly and try all the plates so you can find out which foods you really like," I advised. I gave him a teasing smile. "I'd really hate to have survived all the trouble we've been through, just to end up dying because you choked to death on some food." "I will be more careful," he promised.
"Good, then let's eat."
Over the next 2 hours, we did justice to the feast set before us. Other patrons came and went, and so did some of our plates as we worked our way through the piles. The only other problem we encountered was with the wine. I realized too late that the lightweight former vampire couldn't handle alcohol, even in low quantities. It was nearing 10 when Vince leaned against me with his fork in one hand and a half-empty wine glass in the other. He had a lopsided grin on his face, and his cheeks were flushed.
"Such a pretty place."
"We must come here more often," he suggested. I wrinkled my nose at his breath. It still reeked of stale blood, and now had a mix of pasta sauce and wine added to the unhealthy combination.
"Vince, are you drunk?"
I asked him.
"I think I hiccup maybe," he replied.
I took his wine glass from his hand, and set it on a tray to my left.
"Aha, let's just assume you aren't."
"Liz Stokes?" a voice asked on my left. I turned, and my eyes widened when I recognized one of my old co-workers from the office. He was a guy about my age on the same floor, who talked to me every once in a while.
"Bob,"
I returned. He grinned. "It is you. I thought I was dreaming. Nobody's heard from you in weeks, and the police came searching for you. What the hell happened?" I had a midlife crisis and had to change occupations," I told him. Bob glanced past me and at Vince. I followed his gaze and noticed Vince's blue eyes were narrowed, and his lips were set in a fine line. One of his hands reached up and grasped my arm. Even I had to admit the scene looked suspect, and that's how Bob took it too. "You know, if you're in some sort of trouble you should call the police," Bob suggested. I understood his double meaning. He thought Vince had me captured. That was partly true, especially with his hand around my arm. I tried to shrug it off, but he gripped tighter.
"It's not really that big of a deal."
I just needed some breathing room, and decided to go into business with my partner here. I nodded at Vince and cringed when his hold tightened to a near painful level.
"Not so hard," I hissed.
Bob overheard me and frowned. "Liz, if you're having some sort of trouble I'd be glad to." Vince released my arm and stood. The 5'8" Bob had nothing on the 6-foot-tall vampire. My partner glared down at the short interloper. Gone was the funny drunk, and here was the nasty drunk. She does not need your assistance, he argued.
It sure as hell looks like she does, Bob countered.
I stood between them and pushed the men apart.
Just both of you calm down.
Bob, I'm fine. Vince, I'm fine, so you both just sit back down and… I'll sit down, Bob agreed. I was relieved until he sat down opposite us. He nodded at Vince.
And I'll leave just as soon as he does.
Our waiter hurried over.
Is there a problem? He asked us. No, I think we were just leaving.
Could you bring our bill? I pleaded. He nodded and hurried away to bring a receipt that no doubt equaled the length of Santa's list. Liz, I really think you need to go to the police. They sounded like you were in serious trouble, Bob insisted. She is in no need of your advice, Vince shot back. Bob stood again, placed his palms on the table, and leaned over to glare at Vince.
I think you need to leave, mister.
Vince's reply was to lean over and sock Bob in the jaw. Though my partner was mortal, he hadn't quite lost his skill in knowing where to hit someone. Bob's head whipped to the side, and he slumped backward onto the cushions. I grabbed Vince and tugged him from the booth. Time to go. I yelped. We sprinted through the tables and past the front desk where our bill was still being rung up. Signorina, your bill, our waiter cried out. I tossed the roll of bills onto the counter. Keep the change, I told them. We burst onto the street and to our waiting car. Through the window I could see the discovery of the assault, and our waiter called one of his co-workers to his side. He happened to glance out the window and point at us. Whatever he wanted, I wanted no part of it, and shoved Vince into the passenger seat. I took my seat behind the wheel and started the engine just as one of the waiters rushed through the front doors.
Stop, he cried out.
Stop. I could later use the defense that he said stomp, as I stomped my foot on the gas pedal. We swerved into traffic and down the road, as the distant sounds of police sirens came to my ears. If they found us, there'd be no vampire Vince to speed us out of trouble. Hell, there was barely a human Vince. The man by my side sat hunched over and cradled the fist he'd used on poor Bob.
This is a fine mess you've gotten us into now, I scolded him. Are all human jaws so hard? He asked me.
The throbbing pain from his hand had knocked him out of his insobriety.
Yes, so don't do it again.
I glanced in the rear view mirror and noticed flashing lights. Close at hand was a darkened alleyway, and I turned our very recognizable car into the narrow space and shut off the lights and engine. A few police cars drove past in a hurry, and when their sirens faded in the distance, I allowed myself to slump down in my seat.
That was too close.
I didn't receive a response from my partner, so I tilted my head toward him. He still cradled his hand, and I noticed there was blood on the knuckles. I sat up and scooted over to him for a closer look. Yep, the skin of his knuckles was broken open, and thin red lines flowed over his bones.
Wow, Bob really does have a hard head, I commented.
I noticed Vince's hands shook, and when I looked at his face it was pale, and his lips were tightly pursed. You okay, Vince?
How do I get it to stop? He whispered. Get what to stop?
The bleeding. He lifted his eyes and I saw he was frightened.
Are all human bodies this frail?
I sighed and patted him on the shoulder.
Not all of them, but yours is a little out of practice with being a human.
I think we've had enough fun for tonight, so we'll just get you home and get that bandaged. I scooted back into my seat, but paused and glanced at my partner.
What made you so mad at Bob anyway?
Vince scowled and turned away.
Nothing, he mumbled.
I sighed, started the car, and away we went. Chapter 7. We putted our way back to our apartment building, and I helped the visibly shaken Vince up the stairs to our home. It was a cold, drafty home when we entered, and I settled him on the couch in front of his coffin bed while I filled a glass with water. I returned to him, plopped myself down beside him and offered him the water. Vince shook his head. It'll help with the hangover to have some water in you, I insisted. Vince pursed his lips but took the glass and downed the small contents in one gulp. I turned my attention to the coffin.
So you think you can sleep in that?
I asked him. He set the glass on the top of the coffin and shook his head. This body will suffocate in such confines for so long.
So do you want the... I bounced a little on the couch and winced when a spring jabbed me in the rear. Or maybe we could try the bed.
I could always sleep on the floor if there's enough blankets. Vince sighed and turned away from me.
Very well.
That was the firmest response he'd given me all night, so I left Vince on the couch and readied the bed for its new occupant. There wasn't much to prepare really. Just a few fluffs of the dingy pillows, and an airing of the holy sheets for the formerly unholy creature. There was just enough spare sheets around the room for me to cobble together a bed on the floor for me. I wouldn't be comfortable, but I'd be warm. I hadn't realized how chilly and drafty the apartment was until my vampire-ness was removed. Now I found it was so cold that I could hardly keep from shivering. In a few minutes I stuck my head out and glanced across the room at Vince. He hadn't moved an inch.
All right, bedtime,
I cheerfully called out. Vince slowly rose to his feet and shuffled past me and into the bedroom. He lay himself down atop the sheets. You might want to get under the covers, I suggested. He ignored me and remained as he was. I shrugged and slipped into my own bundle of blankets. After a long, harrowing night of mishaps and mayhem, I was exhausted and fell into a dreamy sleep. I hadn't had any of those since getting stuck to Vince. This one had me riding a Ferris wheel, where all the joints were squeaking, and the operator was that incompetent witch. She tilted her head back and cackled as she pulled the lever to make the machine go faster and louder. There was no way to get off. The noise grew louder. I clapped my hands over my ears. My eyes opened, and I shot up. The room was dark. Through the darkness I could still hear that damn squeaking noise. I cleaned out my ears, but found the source of the problem lay with the bed beside me. Or rather, it lay on the bed. Vince. I crawled on my knees to the side of the bed and looked over the covers. Vince lay in the same spot I remembered, but he was huddled into himself and shivered so hard the rusted bed shook and rattled. I crawled onto the bed and over to him, and gave his shoulder a good shake. Vince. You okay?
I am fine, he chattered.
It's been a long time since you were cold, isn't it? I mused. The sea cold does not bother me, he insisted. Aha. You need to get under the covers, I ordered him. I slipped my arms under his own, and pulled him against the wall at the head of the bed. A hint of faint light lit up the room. I glanced at the covered window, and my eyes widened as I was hit by a wonderful idea. On second thought, let's do one last fun thing before we go to bed, I suggested. I am in no mood, Vince replied.
Oh, come on.
It'll be fun. I slipped a blanket over his shoulders and hefted him off the bed. Vince didn't fight, but he didn't help much. We shuffled our way out the room, out of the apartment, and up the rickety steps until they stopped at a door. This was the door to the roof, and I shoved it open and guided Vince onto the flat rectangular space. Our apartment building wasn't any taller than its neighboring structures, but it wasn't any shorter, so we could see across the roof jungle to the far-off lights of the bustling parts of the metropolis. I led Vince to the eastern ledge of the roof and plopped us down atop some broken pigeon crates. Vince glanced around the roof and scowled at me. Why are we here? He questioned me. I nodded at a sky in front of us. To watch this. Vince followed my gaze. We faced the eastern sky, and in a moment it brightened with the coming of the dawn. Vince's eyes widened, and he jumped to his feet. I snorted and pulled him back down. You're not a vampire anymore, remember? It won't hurt you. I would rather not try, he insisted. Too late. The light of the rising sun crested the city and swept over us. The sun covered everything in its warm glowing brilliance, and a faint dew sparkled against the light. Vince cringed and covered himself with his blanket. My eyes sparkled with the beautiful warm light. I turned to my partner and snorted at the ghost beside me. Not a hint of smoke arose from beneath the sheet. I grabbed the blanket and yanked it from him. His eyes were shut tight, and he was formed into a ball on the crate.
"You're not burning up, so quit being so dramatic," I ordered him.
Vince cautiously opened his eyes. He turned them eastward and beheld the bright, glowing day star. His blue eyes widened, and his mouth dropped slightly open. He stood and stumbled over to the 2-foot-tall ledge that surrounded the rooftop. Vince placed his hands on the wide ledge and leaned over the 60-foot drop. I followed him, and couldn't help smiling at his expression of awe. "My God," I heard him whisper.
"Not bad, huh?"
"Bet it's been a long time since you saw one of these without getting scorched," I replied. "A very long time," he agreed. I smiled and turned my gaze on the bright sun. I closed my eyes and opened wide my arms to take in the warmth. The sun enveloped me in its soothing embrace, and I sighed. "I really missed this," I whispered. "Thank you." My eyes snapped open, and I looked to my partner. He stared straight ahead with his lips pursed together. Did you say something?" I asked him. Vince straightened and coughed. "Thank you for showing me this view. It was nice." I smiled and flung the blanket over his shoulders. "No problem. Now let's get you back to bed before you catch your death of cold." We shuffled our way back to our apartment, and I tucked Vince into bed. His skin was still cool to the touch, but he'd stopped shivering. I took my place on the floor, but in a minute, I heard the familiar squeak of the bed, and I lifted my head to look at my mummified partner.
"Still can't get warm?"
I asked him. "It seems not," he answered. I glanced around the wrecked, drafty room and sighed.
"Yeah, this place is pretty cold."
"I guess there's only one thing left to do." Vince lifted his head and glanced over his shoulder when I climbed onto the bed with my entourage of blankets.
Why are you doing?" he questioned me.
"If your body heat isn't working for you, then you need another body," I told him. I slipped myself beneath the covers and slid toward him. Vince's eyes widened, and he tried to escape me, but he already lay at the edge of the bed.
"I have no need of."
"Bullshit, now just lay still and behave." I wrapped my arm around his waist and pulled him toward me. He twisted and turned his back to me, and his hands caught the edge of the bed, so I scooted until my chest lay against his back. "See? Is that so bad?" Vince lay as stiff as a board, well, one that quivered, and I could practically hear his teeth grind together. "Please release me," he commanded. "Nope," I replied and snuggled closer. Secretly I was grateful for his warmth, as I too was a little bothered by the cold of the room. "Human, release me at once," he demanded. "You're a human now too, so just relax and get some sleep." I closed my eyes and burrowed my face into his long back. He shuddered one last time, but the shivers didn't return. His body was so warm, and I was so tired that my voice drifted into a sleepy whisper. "See? This isn't so bad." I drifted into a beautiful, peaceful human sleep. Chapter 8. Old habits are hard to break, and we slept most of the day away. It wasn't until about 3 that I awoke from my slumber. I didn't bother to open my eyes before I stretched. Or rather, before I tried to stretch. Something had my arms pinned to my sides and both my legs pinned beneath it. I opened my eyes and was met with a view of a white shirt. The things wrapped around my legs were Vince's legs, and his arms were wrapped around me. He held me in his strong, warm embrace as we both lay face to face. I blushed and squirmed. My movements didn't awaken him. He slept like his former undead self. I pressed my hands against his chest and tried to push us apart, but he'd found his male human strength and wouldn't let go. "Vince," I spoke up.
"Vince, let me go."
"I have to go to the bathroom." I glanced up into his face, and my eyes caught on something strange that hadn't been there the day before. "Vince. Vince, wake up." Vince's eyes shot open and he bolted upright. He turned his head this way and that, and in the light of the weak sun through the covered windows I caught my first good glimpse of him. He had wrinkles beneath his eyes and along his chin, and there were streaks of silver hair along his temples. The veins on his hands stood out among his wrinkled flesh, and dark spots covered the back of his palms.
"What is the matter?" he asked me.
I sat up and nodded at his face. "Vince, you're old," I told him. He scowled at me. "I am well aware of my age." "No, your face is all wrinkly," I rephrased. Vince frowned, threw off the blankets and hurried out of the room. I followed him to the bathroom, the only place in the apartment with mirrors. He stared into the mirrors, but the room was too dark to see anything but a dark reflection, so I flicked on the light. Vince started back and his eyes widened. He leaned forward and with a shaking hand, reached up and touched the wrinkles and gray hairs.
"You think it's the hex?"
I asked him. Vince dropped his head and pursed his lips.
"We must go to Bat."
"I will drive," he told me. He swept past me and into the living room.
"What's wrong?"
"What is it?" I questioned him as I followed him out the apartment door and down the stairs. "I'm not sure, but Bat will confirm my suspicions," he replied. Vince drove us to Bat's in record time. Well, a record for a human. We parked the car in the garage, and Vince was at the dividing wall door before I even stepped out of the car. I hurried after him, as he flung himself into the lab. "Bat! Bat!" he called out. He was like a madman, as he rushed through the tables of beakers and bottles. "Bat!
What's the noise about?"
"Can't an old man get some sleep?" a sleepy voice called from the far corner of the lab. Bat rose from a chair seated before one of the tables, and he blinked his bleary eyes at us. Vince raced up to him and grabbed him by the collar. The former vampire pulled the startled mad scientist against him, so their faces nearly touched.
"What's happening to me?"
Bat started away from Vince and raised an eyebrow.
"You seem to have aged," he answered.
Vince shook him as I came up to the pair.
"How do we reverse this aging?" he growled at Bat.
Bat frowned and pried himself from Vince's hold.
"The first thing to do is stop panicking.
The aging process appears to be very slow." My mouth dropped open, and I gestured with both hands to Vince's aged face.
"You call this slow?"
Bat scoffed. "If it were quick, he would have been reduced to a pile of fine dust a half-day ago. Yes, this is certainly a slow aging brought on by the hex, and only the revocation of the hex can reverse the effects. If they can be reversed." I felt the color drain from my face, and saw the same reaction reflected in Vince's face. Vince turned and strode through the tables and back into the garage. Bat sidled up to me, and lowered his voice to a whisper. "Stay close to him," he instructed me.
"To sweep up his ashes,"
I returned. He shook his head, and his lips were tightly pursed together. "No, to keep him from harming himself. I haven't seen him so lost in fear and anger since, well, for a very long time. He may harm himself, so he needs you to protect him from himself." I snorted. Guardian angel for a former vampire. I'd better get a nice halo with my wings when this is done. I followed my frantic partner, and stepped into the garage just as he was backing the car out. "Hey, wait a sec." I rushed around the front, and was glad I left the door open as I swung myself inside and slammed the door shut. I glared at Vince, but his attention was on backing up. "You could have at least waited for me." Vince's only reply was to clear the driveway to the garage, and step on the gas as hard as he could, so we sped down the alleyways and onto the main roads in the slums. I grabbed the handle at every tight turn. "Could you slow down?" I yelled at him. "No. Could you at least give the hex a chance to kill us instead of doing it yourself?" I growled. "No." I flung myself across the seat, grabbed the wheel from his control and stomped my left foot on the brake. We screeched to a wobbly stop, just short of crashing into a stop sign. I turned to Vince and scowled at him.
"What the hell is wrong with you?"
"We've faced dangers before. Hell, you've faced a hell of a lot of dangers in your life. What's the problem now?" He frowned and turned away. My eyebrows crashed down, and I grabbed his chin and turned him so he faced me.
What the hell is the problem?
I repeated. Vince tore his chin from my hands but still faced me. I will not die of old age. My mouth dropped slightly open.
Is that it?
After all the other trouble we've had, you're afraid of dying of old age? He snarled and turned away. You would not understand. I crossed my arms over my chest. Try, I paused and sighed. That was right, Vince was scared. My arms dropped to my sides and my voice softened. Come on, Vince. Haven't we been through enough that you can tell me what's bothering you? He opened his mouth, clamped it shut and shook his head. You can't begin to understand the loathing I have for age. I have not known aging for many centuries. It is as foreign as an exotic disease is to you, and is completely fatal. But everybody dies, I argued. Vince whipped his head to me, and his narrowed blue eyes glared at me. I do not die. Not of that.
So you're what?
Wanting to die some other way. You want to kick the bucket, in a heroic fashion with guns blazing? I guessed. He sneered.
Something like that.
I scooted closer and touched his arm. Vince, you're not going to die of anything anytime soon because I'm not going to let you do that. Not just because you take me with you, but because I just don't want to see you die at all, okay? You're a pain in the ass, but you're my pain in the ass. Vince's face relaxed and he raised an eyebrow.
Your pain in the ass, he repeated.
I blushed and turned away and crossed my arms over my chest. Hey, a girl cannot want a guy she knows to die. My eyes flickered over to him. Besides, you're kind of cute with those grey hairs at your temple. It gives you a sort of raw algal look, with the added bonus that you're a little ghoulish. Vince stared straight ahead and sighed. I am. His voice faded off so I couldn't hear the last word.
You're what?
I asked him. He frowned. I am sorry, he spoke in a louder voice.
I should not have panicked as I did.
I smiled.
Well, you can panic all you want, just don't try killing us with the car.
I'd like to go out in a blaze of glory, but not because the car's on fire from the crash. A shadow of a smile slipped onto his lips. I will be a more cautious driver, he promised. I smiled and shrugged.
Good, now let's get going.
Where are we going, anyway? I asked him. He started up the car and drove us back on the road, but with less panic. To Hawthorne Avenue. I frowned and tapped my chin. Isn't that where you said a bunch of witches live?
Yes.
That is the registration office for the guild in this city, he explained. Registration? What are they registering?
Witches.
Chapter 9. We drove through the slums to a city block much like our lovely home. There was the usual apartment buildings, but these were smaller and older. They barely had 4 floors, and were spaced apart to allow for wider alleys between them. Vince stopped us in front of one of the less ugly buildings. None of the windows were broken, but they were all dark, and nothing moved behind the thick curtains that hung in them. Nothing moved on the street either, as Vince led me up the tall stoop and through the double doors. It was like we'd entered another building. The lobby was as large as a 5-star hotel reception area, and all the decrepit aspects on the outside stayed on the outside. The floors were polished marble, and the redwood walls hung with old expensive tapestries. A grand staircase stood at the back, and to the left was an elevator. On the right side of the lobby stood a long, elegant mahogany front desk, and behind the desk sat a secretary. The woman looked like any other secretary, about 40 with hints of grey and with her mouth pressed in an eternal frown. She sat in a large high-back plush chair and filed her nails. The only unusual aspect about her was the fact that the nail file floated in the air while her free hand held a magazine. At our entrance, she sat at attention and snapped her fingers. The nail file plopped itself into a drawer, and the drawer closed on its own.
How can I help you? She asked us.
Vince led me up to the desk, and I was glad to see his step held its usual confidence. We need witch identification and her known address, he told her. The secretary snorted. We can't just give out that information to anybody. There has to be a good reason, or authorization from the head witch. I frowned. How are we supposed to even identify the witch, if we don't know her name? I wondered. The secretary gave me a condescending look. If you've been hexed by a registered witch, then we can easily find out by examining the hex and identifying her magic fingerprint. However, we don't go around identifying all the hexes someone's been cursed with, and letting strangers stalk down our members. There has to be a good reason for us to reveal our sisters to anyone, especially a pair of humans. Vince reached across the desk and grabbed her by the collar. He dragged her toward him so their faces nearly touched. His voice was calm, but firm and slightly terrifying. Dying is a very good reason, he told her. I think that's the first time I've seen you lose your temper in 100 years, a voice quipped. We turned to see a beautiful, voluptuous woman of 25 emerge from the elevator. She was a woman most other females envied, what with her huge assets and a tight shirt to show them off. Earrings in the shape of witches' brooms dangled from her ears, and she strode up to us in red high heels with a matching dress that had a slit that went up to her waist. Vince dropped the secretary and straightened himself. The secretary pressed her clothes with her hand, and pointed an accusing finger at us. But Miss Vera, these intruders were.
It's fine, Mona.
The woman known as Vera tapped her way over to Vincent, and slid a thin, delicate finger across his shoulder. Vincent is always allowed in here. If you'll come this way. She turned our attention to the elevator. Vincent followed her, and I felt like a third leg as I followed him. We climbed aboard, and I noticed there were 50 buttons on the panel, and 50 numbers on the indicator above the elevator doors. The exterior of the building had only shown 4 floors. The doors shut behind us, and the woman tapped one of her hands on the button with the number 50 on it. She turned to Vince and slyly smiled at him. You should have told me you were coming. I could have slipped into something more comfortable, she teased. Her eyes swept over him. A very nice look with your grey hairs. It suits you without looking fake.
The grey was not my choice, Vince replied. Yes, I know.
Your life pulses are so weak that I barely sensed you enter the building. You should be dead in a few days, she commented. I felt the color drain from my face.
Is that it?
Vera turned her attention on me, and her smile didn't waver. Unless you can get the hex off you. I imagine it must be quite the complication being chained to each other with those rings, the woman replied. I tucked my ring hand behind me and glanced between Vince and her. You two know each other for a while? We used to date until he lost his humor with his soul, she explained. She turned to Vince and wrapped her arms around his neck. Her breasts squished up against Vince, but he only turned his face to the side so they didn't bump noses. He was quite the rowdy young man in his younger days. I tamped down the surprising rise of jealousy inside of me.
So do you know how to break the hex that's killing us?
Yes and no. The elevator rang, and the doors opened to reveal a small entrance hall with a pair of double doors 10 yards from the elevator. Vera slipped off Vince, stepped out of the elevator and led us through the double doors. Beyond the entrance hall was a lavish suite decked out in purples and blacks. There was a living room situated in a center depression, and she directed us to the couch. She herself took a lush seat close to Vince's cushion.
I know who put the spell on you.
Any witch with training can know the magic fingerprints of another. Simone is poorly skilled but very gifted, she commented.
But can you get it off?
I persisted. She shook her head. No. Only the witch who placed the hex can revoke it. Fortunately, I may be able to help you find her. Or rather, she might be able to help you find her. Her apartment is on one of the lower floors. You can look through her things, and maybe find a clue as to her whereabouts.
That's what you detectives do, isn't it?
I scowled at her.
Then why didn't you just take us there?
Her sly eyes flickered to Vince. Because I'd like some info myself, and my questions didn't need to be overheard in the lobby. Her smile faded and her eyes grew cold. With that look of cool hatred, I could understand how she got the top suite of the witch place. One of my old friends, Hilda, was recently murdered by some of Ruthven's men, and I want to know why. I heard you were dealing with Ruthven, and hoped you could answer my question. Vince stood and shook his head. Ruthven is too dangerous a man for you to be asking questions of. Vera snorted and waved away his concerns.
That's unusually gallant for you.
Your humanity in that body must be causing you to slip, but I don't care about the dangers. Many of my witch sisters are scared that Ruthven has started a war against witches. Nothing I say will calm them, and I can't give them any answers to their questions. Now, are you going to give me some answers, or are you going to waste the precious few days you have left looking through the 50 floors in this building searching for Simone's room? We don't know why Ruthven killed her, I spoke up. Vince glared at me, but I shrugged.
That's what we were trying to find out when that witch hexed us.
She raised an eyebrow at Vince. I know you and Ruthven have some sort of long-standing disagreement, but why should you care about his murdering of a witch? Because he murdered Tim for a reason, and that reason involves Hilda, Vince told her. Vera snorted.
That's rich.
You caring for your old partner. That hex of Simone's must have packed a powerful life spell to put that much soul into you. I jumped to my feet, pressed my fists to my hips and scowled at her. He cared about Tim's murder before the hex. If you really knew him and cared about him, you'd know that already, and wouldn't be sitting here wasting our time while he stands there dying. She frowned. I wouldn't be asking if it wasn't important, she argued.
What's more important than Vince's life?
I snapped at her.
Some stupid questions you want to ask?
Ask them later, stop wasting our time, and give us that floor number. Vera's eyes narrowed, and she slowly slid off the couch and onto her feet. A purple mist floated from her fingers. I've heard some stories about you, little girl, but you obviously don't know anything about me. I haven't lived 200 years and learned thousands of hexes just to have some inductee into the paranormal society tell me what I should and shouldn't do with my time.
Well, guess what?
This little inductee is telling you you're being a total ass by standing here talking while Vince is dying. If you've got some questions, write them down and send them to us via ghost post, or however somebody sends messages in this stupid society, I growled. Vera raised one of her glowing hands as though to strike me, but Vince's hand snapped out and he caught her wrist.
That's enough, he told her.
The witch turned to him, with the corners of her mouth turned down in a snarl. I haven't forgotten the rule about you dying with your partner, but this little brat needs to learn some manners. She just can't snap her jaws at anyone she pleases. His eyes narrowed, and I noticed his grip on her wrist tightened. I won't let you harm her, he repeated. Vera's eyes widened, and they flickered between Vince and me. The tension in the room was broken when she erupted in a laugh. I stepped back and wondered if she'd lost her mind. Vince held tight to her wrist. Vera managed to get a grip on her humor, and she wiped the tears from her eyes.
Now, isn't this extraordinary?
Could the unemotional ancient vampire actually have feelings for a human female? Vince started back from her proclamation and released her wrist. She rubbed the reddened skin with her glowing hands, and the redness disappeared beneath her fingertips. My, you have lost much of your grip with that hex. And does my eyes deceive me, and I detect a hint of a blush on those pale cheeks of yours? Vince straightened and his lips thinned. This conversation will only lead to a dead end. Which apartment belongs to the girl? He insisted. Vera chuckled, and sunk onto her plush chair cushions. Her eyes turned their penetrating stare on me. You've shown me quite the miracle, so I'll tell you. Her room's on the 3rd floor, the first room on the left. She reached into her low-cut dress and pulled out a key.
This will unlock the door.
She tossed the key to Vince, who deftly caught the item in one hand. Vince bowed his head, and strode out the door to the entrance hall. I moved to join him but paused and half turned to the witch.
"What miracle did I show you?"
I asked her. Her lips curled up in a smile that held more admiration than mockery.
"That a vampire's dormant heart can still beat."
"We must leave," Vince called from the hallway outside the suite.
"You'd better hurry."
"Vincent doesn't like to be kept waiting," she advised me. I gave the witch one last scrutinizing gaze before I hurried after my partner. Chapter 10. I found Vince near the elevator doors with a frown on his face.
"We don't have time to waste," he scolded me.
I opened my mouth to reply, but a terrible shrieking noise interrupted my words. It repeated itself over and over again, in a loop of high-pitched screaming. The doors to Vera's apartment swung open. "Werewolves have infiltrated the building and are making their way up to the 3rd floor," she shouted at us. Vince turned away from her and slammed his hand on the elevator button. The doors swung open and we hurried inside, but with one extra passenger. Vera joined us. The doors swung shut, and she looked up at the floor dial above the doors.
"Where are they now, Mona?"
The secretary's voice spoke through the dial. "I deactivated all other elevators, but they are taking the stairs and are almost to the 3rd floor." Vera frowned.
"What about the hex traps?"
"They're nullifying them with magical tomes," Mona replied. Vera slammed her hand against the wall below the button board and growled. "Damn Ruthven and his books of blasphemy." "Books of blasphemy? You mean those books with all the spells?" I asked her. She removed her hand from the wall and showed an indent where her magic-enhanced hand left its mark.
"Yes.
He's gathered much of his perverted magic into those books that have spilled on the market. I didn't think the spells could be mastered by anyone but Ruthven, but this proves me wrong. Get us down to the 3rd floor. We will deal with them," Vince spoke up. Vera turned to him with a raised eyebrow and looked him up and down.
"How?"
"You're weak, even for a human." Vince held up his ring hand, and the ring on his finger glowed red. "We still have these at our disposal." The witch frowned.
"That's powerful magic for 2 humans to be wielding."
"It might destroy you," she warned us. "Do we have a choice?" Vince countered.
"Yes."
"Stand back and let me do the work. I'm not going to let a couple of wannabe wizards and werewolves storm in here and come out alive. They've made it my fight now, and I'm going to give them a hell of a one." She pressed her finger to the 3rd floor button, and her glowing purple magic slipped into the button. The speed of the elevator jumped from a floor every 5 seconds to 10 floors every second. The elevator rattled and rocked, and I stumbled backward. Vince caught me against him, and I sheepishly looked up at him. "I never did like those carnival rides where I was dropped really quick," I told him. He righted me and pulled me to his side. "When the doors open, stay behind me," he commanded me. I scowled at him. "We're partners and partners don't hide behind partners," I argued. "Stop bickering like an old married couple, because you're both staying in here while I take care of my uninvited guests," Vera spoke up.
"This is also our fight," he reminded her.
On cue, the elevator jerked to a stop, and the doors swung open to reveal a hallway that stretched off to our right and left. Doors lined the opposite side of the hallway, and there was a single door on the left at the far end of the hall, on the same wall as the elevator. Vera stepped out and turned to face the door. Vince grabbed my wrist and pulled me out but made sure we kept behind Vera. As we stood there, I heard the near rumblings of heavy padded footsteps and lasers. The noises came from behind the door, at the far end of the left side of the hall. "You have lasers?" I asked Vera. "The security system works on magic, and creates what it deems to be the most effective weapons against the intruders. In this case, singed werewolf and wizard is the preferred method for dealing with our guests," she explained. There was a loud crash, and she frowned.
"But it seems it won't hold them for..."
At that moment, the door at the end of the hall flew off its hinges and crashed halfway down the hall. It slid to a stop at Vera's feet, and her lips curled into a snarl. In the doorway stood a man dressed in a black robe with a hood. He held one of the accursed books open in one hand, and had his free hand raised over the pages. Behind him was the fire escape stairwell, and the steps were crowded with a dozen fully transformed slobbering werewolves. The stench of burned hair wafted to our noses, and there were burnt patches of fur all over their bodies. The wizard at the front stepped out. Vera rolled up her sleeves and marched toward him. Her hands were held at her sides and a little in front of her, and the purple color changed to black, and enveloped the entirety of her hands in the dark light.
"You're not wanted here, so leave," she ordered the intruders.
"Don't interfere with us, woman," the robed man hissed. Vera stopped 20 yards from them, placed one hand on her hip, and held her other hand palm out in front of her. The purple glow on her hands brightened.
"Don't say I didn't warn you."
A blast of dark energy shot from her hand. The punch was so powerful, she slid back a few yards along the linoleum floor. The glowing energy lit up the hallway in dark and light shadows, and barreled toward our enemies. The hooded figure wiggled the fingers of his free hand, and a greenish beam of light erupted from the pages. It swept from the book and slammed into Vera's energy. The two balls of brightness collided and mixed in a yin-yang fight to the death. It was mutual destruction, as the energies dissipated and vanished. The hooded figure chuckled.
"Is that all the great Vera can produce?" he mocked her.
Vera smirked.
"There's something very important you haven't learned about that book, wizard," she countered.
He lifted his cloaked face, and I saw his skin was as pale as death, and sweat from his forehead traveled down his cheeks. The abilities of the book sapped his strength.
"What is that?" he asked her.
Vera held out both her hands, palms out toward him. "I can use both my hands and you can't." A large energy ball formed between Vera's close hands. The ball of dark magic illuminated the hallway, so that I could hardly look at Vera without being blinded. The energy pushed off from her hands and sent her sailing backwards. Vince leapt forward and caught her before she fell. Vera's magic zoomed across the hallway toward our enemies. The werewolves yipped and fled down the stairs while the wizard's eyes widened in horror. He conjured up another energy ball, larger than his first but minuscule compared to the raging circle that barreled toward him. His magic shot from the book and collided with Vera's energy. The smaller ball was swallowed by the larger one, and Vera's magic slammed into his body. He let out a terrible scream as he was swallowed whole by the energy. It plunged him into its depths, and tore apart his body into small particles that disappeared into the light. His book clattered to the ground, all that remained of the wizard, and the ball swept past where he'd stood and down the stairwell. In a few seconds there came to our ears the sound of wolves howling in pain, and then silence. Vera chuckled as Vince righted her. She smoothed out the wrinkles in her dress, and put her hands on her hips as she stared at the empty hallway in front of us.
"That's how you do real magic," she commented.
Vince strode past her and picked up the closed book. "Do you know how to destroy these?" he asked her. Vera frowned at him. "Can't you ever give a girl a little credit? Can you?" He persisted. Vera sighed and moved to stand by his side. I joined them down the hall. She took the book from him and turned it over in her hands. "I could, but it would take a very hot purifying fire to destroy the cover. Then prepare one, and send out your witches to the underground black markets. Ruthven has set thousands of these for sale on the market," Vince told her. Vera snorted and held up her hand.
"Now wait a second.
Ruthven and his men breaking into Witches' Inc. is one thing, but going up against his black market dealings is a completely different brew. He has more than just wizards and werewolves waiting in the wings if my girls were to go in there and get themselves killed trying to steal these books from his sellers and buyers." Vince nodded at the book in her hands. "It's only a matter of time before people with minor magic skills master the simpler spells and edge your sisters out of the business of hexing people." Vera tapped one of her long fingernails against her chin and furrowed her brow. After a moment's thought she sighed and crossed her arms over her ample chest. "I really hate it when you see things so clearly. Fine then, I'll send out my witches to fetch these books and burn them, but how many more are going to be produced? When can I tell them they've done enough? When we inform you that the source has been dealt with, Vince told her. Vera frowned at him. You can't be serious. That would mean dealing with Ruthven, and nobody's dealt with him since he emerged from whatever cesspool he crawled out of.
Then it's past time he was dealt with, Vince replied.
I raised my hands toward Vince with the palms facing toward him.
Wait a second, we're going to do what now?
I questioned him. If necessary, we will deal with Ruthven and his ilk, he rephrased. Vera raised an eyebrow, and her eyes flickered between Vince and me. And you two humans are going to do it? After the hex is raised, Vince added. There's a lot of room in this vague plan for failure, Vera noted. And death, I commented. We will see, but for now we must first deal with this hex. He pulled Celine's room key from his jacket, and strolled past us to the first room on the left from the elevator. I turned to Vera, and nodded at the retreating back of my partner. You think he's really serious? Vera's lips were pressed tightly together, and there was a pallor in her face that I didn't like. More serious than I've ever seen him. Her eyes flickered to me. I don't know how much influence you have over his decisions, but if I were you, I would change his mind about going up against Ruthven. He isn't a man to take lightly, much less plunge headfirst into seeking revenge for a dead partner. You think that's why he's doing it? Because of Tim? I asked her. She sighed and shrugged. I wish I knew what he ever did, but seriously, try to talk him out of it. My witches and I can handle the books, but I don't think even Vincent can handle Ruthven.
So it's a suicide mission?
I guessed. Vera nodded. Seems like it. If you want to extend your life with that ring, you'd better talk him out of it. I snorted. Like that's going to happen. Vera scrutinized me for a moment, and the edges of her mouth twitched up.
I think if anyone could, you could.
I raised an eyebrow. A lot of people keep telling me that, but I'm not seeing much proof. She chuckled, wrapped an arm around my shoulders, and guided me down the hall. Then think of it as a pleasant surprise, when you can believe it. Chapter 11. By the time we reached the door to Simone's room, Vince had opened the entrance and stepped inside. Vera followed him, and I peeked through the doorway. The apartment room was much like my old one, with one giant room, and the bed and bath on the far left through their respective doors. The kitchen and dining room lay to the immediate left, and in front of us was the living room. The place was messy, and the furniture was mismatched. There was an overpowering smell of cigarette smoke that permeated the furniture and walls. We offer the rooms to our sisters for a small fee, but they furnish the spaces, Vera informed us. Vince stood only a yard into the room, and Vera tried to pass him. He held out his arm and blocked her path. She frowned at him.
What are you? Something isn't right, he told her.
Vera swept her eyes over the room, and returned her attention to Vincent. I see nothing magic-induced. Because it isn't. Vince swiped a plastic apple from a bowl near the entrance and knelt close to the floor. He rolled the apple forward, and it hit a rug that lay 2 feet in front of him. The apple bumped over the side of the rug, and onto the fabric. The jaws from a hunting trap sprang up and snatched the fake apple. Its teeth sank deep into the plastic, and would have done the same to an ankle or a leg. Vince stood and frowned. As I feared. Simple human traps. Vera's mouth was agape as she turned to Vince.
How did you know it was there? She asked him. The rug is the only clean article in the room, so it must be new.
New rugs are used for company or traps. In this case, I assumed a trap, and that weight would trigger it, he commented. Vera slyly smiled. You really are a good detective. He held up one of his wrinkled hands and shook his head. But this body limits me. If there are more traps, they might not be found until one of us activates them.
Leave that to me.
Vera stepped in front of him, and held her hands out on either side of her.
Now that I know what I'm looking for, these traps shouldn't be a problem.
Her fingers glowed the beautiful dark violet, and the magic swept from her hands like a thick mist. It flowed to the ground and across the floor. Everything, from furniture to the kitchen sink, was covered by her fog. The sounds of clacks, clanks, and springs erupted all over the apartment, and Vera frowned.
It looks like she set a lot of traps.
Renters aren't supposed to do that, she commented. The fog receded, and Vera lowered her arms.
That's all the human traps, and I didn't detect any hexes, she assured us. What happens if you find out a renter's set a trap?
I asked her. Immediate expulsion, she replied. I winced.
She must have been pretty desperate to protect herself.
She may have suspected Ruthven was searching for her, Vera suggested. She crossed her arms and turned to Vince.
But what I'd like to know is what she has to do with Ruthven.
We will know when we find her, Vince replied. He strode past her and began to rummage through the drawers, cushions, cupboards, and nooks of the apartment. Any idea what we're looking for? I asked him. No, was the depressing reply. I turned to Vera. Maybe you'd know. I wondered. She shook her head. Simone wasn't intimate with me. She preferred Hilda's company, and Hilda preferred nature to the confines of Witch's Ink, she told me. I raised an eyebrow.
Is that a syndicate?
Witch's Ink is what we call our coven in this city, and a nickname for this building. The coven is where witches register themselves, so they can legally practice their hexes and offer services to humans and supernaturals alike, she explained. Great, more bureaucracy, I mumbled. Our chatter was interrupted when Vince's food caught on a different rug. He tried to catch himself with the aid of the couch, but his hand slid off the slick fabric that covered the arm, and he fell onto the floor. Vince. Vincent. We hurried over and knelt on either side of him. He struggled to sit up, but waved away our worried, caring hands. I am fine, he grunted.
It was merely a fall.
Vera frowned and grabbed his hand. I noticed there were more spots than earlier that afternoon. You have less time than I thought. The aging process is growing faster. You may not make it more than a day.
That will be enough time if we can find a clue to her whereabouts, Vince insisted.
He stood on his shaky feet and pursed his cracked, wrinkled lips together.
There must be something to show us, he murmured.
I stood and rubbed my chin. If I was a clumsy, panicked witch, where would I? Aha. One sec. I broke from our small group and rushed into the bedroom. A quick sweep of the room showed me a bed and a dresser. The dresser was what I wanted. I jumped at it and tore apart the sock and underwear drawers just as Vera and Vince strolled in after me. After a minute of frantic searching, the drawer was all searched out, and I was left empty-handed. Well, except for the underwear and a bra. My shoulders slumped over and I frowned.
I was sure something would be here.
It always is in the movies, I grumbled. Vera laughed and moved over to me to pat me on the shoulder. The movies are more glamorous than the reality. I snorted and lifted up the old, cheap lingerie.
You're telling me?
I glanced past her and at Vince. His hand was clasped around something, and I nodded at his clenched fist.
What's that? The clue we needed, he told me.
Vincent found it in a glass bowl on the kitchen counter. It's a matchbook with the address of a seedy bar and hotel in the underground, Vera explained. I don't encourage any of my sisters to go there, but Simone was always a hard one to control when she'd made up her mind to do something.
So is this place near the Boo Bar?
I wondered. Vince shook his head. No, it lies outside the regulated district. I cringed.
That sounds like sewer territory.
It is. We need to go there now. He turned and exited the room. Vera and I followed, and in a moment we were in the hall, and she locked up the room. She turned to us with a bright smile.
Now you two don't get yourselves killed.
I don't look good in black, and I hate funerals. It isn't our plan, Vince told her. Vera snorted.
I don't think you have a plan, but if you did, I'd say it wouldn't work.
Simone is chaos itself and she won't be easy to approach, she warned us. Vince bowed his head to her. We will be mindful of that. Thank you for the help. He strode over to the elevator doors, and I turned to Vera with a wide grin. Thanks for the help. We probably would have been wolf chow by now, I told her. Vera's eyes flickered past me at my partner, and she lowered her voice. You're not out of the woods yet until you find Simone and bring her back here, but whatever happens, promise me you won't let Vince use that ring of his. I raised an eyebrow. You said earlier it might kill a couple of humans. I'm guessing that's true. She shrugged, but nodded down at the ring on my finger.
I don't know if it's true, but those rings are nothing but trouble.
Promise me you'll keep him from playing the hero and using that thing. A faint smile slipped onto her lips.
Stop him even if you have to knock him out.
He'll thank you later. If there is a later, but I promise I'll try to keep him from playing the hero, but there's no telling what this human Vince is going to do, I pointed out. Vera chuckled.
Yes, he's like the old boyfriend I remember, but get along now.
He's tapping his foot and giving us his old glare. I half turned and waved to her.
Well, hopefully we'll see you later.
See you soon, she returned. I joined Vince at the elevator doors, and in a moment they opened and we stepped inside. The doors closed, and the elevator descended at its normal speed. We stood side by side and Vince's eyes flickered down at me.
What did you speak of with Vera? He asked me.
I shrugged.
Oh, just some girl things.
You wouldn't understand. Vince raised an eyebrow.
Try me.
I playfully scowled at him.
That's my line.
No stealing my lines. A ghost of a grin slipped across his lips, and I put my hands on my hips.
You're teasing me, aren't you? You must be mistaken, he countered.
The elevator reached the first floor, and Vince stepped out and strode across the lobby to the front doors. Get back here when I'm scolding you, I shouted as I hurried after him. Shush, Mona hissed from the front desk.
Shush yourself, I shot back.
Mona's eyes widened, and her jaw dropped low enough to hit her desk. I caught Vince outside as he paused just on the other side of the doors. One of his hands was pressed against a small bit of wall beside the doors, and he clutched at his chest. His breathing came out in sharp, short rasps, and I noticed his wrinkled, wizened hand over his heart trembled. I put a hand on his shoulder, and was surprised at how thin was his arm. You okay? I asked him. He shrugged off my hand and straightened. Both arms dropped to his sides, and he mastered control of his breathing. I am fine. It is merely this frail body bothering me. Vince strode down the stairs into our car. I followed him, and ignored my passenger side to trail him around to the other side of the car. Vince opened the door and raised his leg. A popping noise echoed from his hip joint, and he grimaced and lowered his leg back to the ground. I hurried over to him.
I don't think you're okay, I told him.
My joints refuse to work properly, he admitted.
That's what I thought.
All right, Grandpa, that means I'm driving until we get you fixed, I insisted. I was surprised and a little alarmed when Vince didn't argue. He stepped back, walked around the car and seated himself in the passenger seat. Vince focused his gaze on the road ahead of us, and avoided eye contact with me. I slid into the driver's chair and stared at him, until he turned his head and glared back at me. Speak or drive, he demanded.
Then I'll speak.
You sure you don't need me to drop you off at Bats or something? You're not doing so well, I pointed out. He returned his attention to the road ahead. I will be fine when the hex is removed, he assured me.
Yeah, but we still have to find the witch, I reminded him.
And we are wasting time sitting here speaking when we should be driving, he snapped back. I scowled but started the car and drove forward. Where is this other underground place anyway? Beneath an abandoned sewer treatment plant along the river, he told me. I cringed.
Sounds like a lovely place.
How do we get there? Chapter 12. Vince directed me to the river road, well above the location of the 9th precinct, and on the opposite side of the river. By this time our adventures swallowed the rest of the afternoon, and night had fallen. I never thought I'd miss being a part vampire, but driving in the dark without the vampire ability to penetrate the blackness wasn't quite as much fun. Because the less fashionable underground was on the other side of the river, we were forced to drive across one of the less used bridges. As we bumped over the dark, sludgy water of the river, Vince pointed to a decrepit road on the left that wound down to a small parking lot. "Park down there," he instructed me. I pulled the car over, and in a moment we were parked. We stepped out, and I took a whiff of air, and immediately regretted it. The air smelled like a skunk had made love to a garbage truck, and their kids were sludge monsters. I clamped my hand over my nose and tried not to gag. "Lovely places we get to see," I commented. "This way," Vince instructed me. He led me beneath the bridge and to a large upright grate, stuck into the hill opposite the river. The grate covered a large sewer culvert that had a trail of muck oozing from the bottom. He grabbed a hold of the grate and pulled. Nothing happened to the grate, but Vince gave a few more yanks before he was winded. "I may need assistance," he told me. "No problem." I grabbed hold of the grate, and together we pulled the heavy metal bands to one side until an opening was large enough for us to fit. Vince squeezed through, and I followed him into the dank darkness. I worried Vince forgot about his inability to see in the dark, but my concerns were brushed aside when, about 50 feet inside the culvert, torches appeared on the walls as in the other part of the underground. We zigged and zagged our way through the culvert for a half-mile until the tin pipe ended, and a large, high, expansive area began. The large space was the site of the lower part of a former sewage treatment plant. Massive pipes wound their way between the buildings that sat on the ground level, and other buildings sat atop some of the large pipes in a mishmash of a metal hill. The streets were narrow and lit, with recycled lampposts discarded by the city because of damage or ineffective lighting. Dark alleys lay between the buildings, and the structures themselves were made of discarded trash. Some were welded together strips of roofing and siding, and others were wooden crates stacked one on top of the other. The riffraff buildings sat on a dozen blocks of various sizes, and the people who ambled through the streets mimicked the beauty of the buildings. The attire customers of these fine establishments varied from hobo to serial killer. Many had scars on their bodies, and most had tattoos. Zombies shuffled along on one leg with their rotted flesh dragging on the ground, and witches cackled in small groups and showed off their latest spells in books sewn from some sort of animal skin. A few mummies with torn and soiled wrappings panhandled on the corners, and werewolves on leashes were led by raggedy wizards. I noticed there were fewer entrances to this slum paradise. They didn't welcome unexpected visitors. Vince led me into this mess of supernatural outcasts, and through the front blocks to the back streets. I tripped over trash and jumped over dank puddles.
"Nice place," I mumbled.
"Quiet," he shot back. We reached the next street, and he took a hard right into the mouth of a nearby alley. Ahead of us on this second street was an intersection, and on the far corner stood a 4-floor building made of discarded railroad ties and thin slabs of particle board that covered the exterior like scabs. An anchor sat over the front door, which was positioned at an angle to the street, so that it faced directly at us. Patrons leered at the ladies of the night who stood outside, and inside I heard yelling and loud music. The name of the place was the Sea Slug. I thought it very appropriate, as I stamped on a couple of the buggers while we stood in that rotten alley. We hid in the darkness, and behind a mess of garbage cans that overflowed with trash. Vince nodded at the tall building.
"The matchbox came from there."
"Our best hope to get inside without being noticed is to slip in the back door." "You've already been noticed." We both jumped a foot in the air, and spun around to peer into the deeper darkness of the alley. A figure stood from behind a large can, and in the dim light I recognized our old acquaintance Parasquad zombie officer George Romero. "What are you doing here?" Officer Romero growled. I clapped my fists on my hips and glared back at him.
What the hell are you doing here?
Isn't this a little outside your jurisdiction? I countered. He frowned. Our jurisdiction is wherever a supernatural causes trouble, and there's always trouble here. He nodded at the sleazy establishment. We heard rumors there were illegal magic books being sold here. We're hoping to catch some of the dealers. You would be better to wait and speak with Witch Vera before you attempt to capture the dealers, Vince advised him. Romero raised an eyebrow.
What's she got to do with these books?
She has offered her sisters and herself to capture and destroy them, Vince explained.
Well, whether or not she is, we don't have time to go visiting right now.
You just get your undead. Romero paused and leaned in closer to us. He sniffed the air and started back.
What the hell happened to you two?
It's a long story, but we must get inside, Vince insisted. Romero shook his head.
No way.
The bust is happening tonight, and we don't need you. I whipped my arm up and pointed my finger at something behind Romero. Is that a mummy stealing a zombie's arm? I shouted. Romero swung around, and I grabbed Vince's arm and dragged him out of the alley. Hey! I heard Romero shout, but that only made me run faster. I dragged the wheezing and aged Vince across the intersection, past the front of the Sea Slug, and into an alley that abutted the left side of the bar. We pressed our backs against the wall of the building and gasped for breath. Beside me, Vince clutched his chest and grimaced. We must hurry, he wheezed.
You're telling me, I agreed.
I lifted one of my hands to run it through my hair, but my hand froze in front of my face. There were wrinkles and large veins on the back of my hand. Vince. I showed my hand to him, and he frowned. Our joined rings have passed my aging onto you, he surmised. I grabbed his wrinkled hand in mine, and pulled him toward a door on the side of the bar. Then we'd better get this done before we're both hobbling after this witch, I suggested. We tried the door, and I thanked every god but Astaroth that it was unlocked. I peeked my head inside and saw we were in a back hall, with a wooden staircase on our left. The hallway stretched forward to the kitchen, and the rowdy main area where there was the loud noises of carousing and singing. If this witch is hiding, she will be upstairs in one of the rooms, Vince told me.
How many rooms are there?
I asked him.
The top floor has rooms to let, and the second and third floor are reserved for guests of the ladies, he explained.
I raised an eyebrow.
You been here as a patron?
I teased. He pursed his lips but said nothing and turned onto the stairs. The steps wound in a tight circle upward to the other 3 floors. The walls enclosed the stairs in a tight, claustrophobic loop, and I was glad for the railing when I developed a dizziness that made my aching head swoon. I had trouble breathing, and every step grew into a chore. Getting old really sucked. Each landing signaled a floor, but we climbed higher and higher until we reached the 4th and final floor where the stairs ended. Vince led me into a single long hallway that stretched the full length of the building. There were old faded wood doors spaced 10 feet apart on either side, and showed the rooms were incredibly tiny. We tiptoed down the hall, and at each door Vince listened for a moment, then continued to the next entrance. What are we looking for? I whispered.
Shush, he returned.
I frowned and followed him, but at each door he left I pressed my ear to the rotting wood. I regretted my decision when I heard the sounds of lustful moans and cries. My face reddened, and I hurried after Vince.
I thought you said the business part was downstairs, I hissed.
The women room here and often mix business with pleasure, he explained. I was just about to tell him off, when he paused at a door and his brow furrowed. Vince pressed harder against the door and raised an eyebrow. He grabbed the knob and without a sound, he turned the handle. It stuck, telling both of us it was locked. He reached into his long jacket and pulled out a jingling set of skeleton keys, and tried them one at a time. All this time we were completely silent, though any soft noise would have been drowned out by the rowdy sounds 1 to 3 floors below us. The third key worked, and Vince tentatively opened the door. He peeked through the crack for a moment, and then turned to me. Stay behind me and touch nothing. I nodded. We'd already seen one of Simone's place of residence. She no doubt had this apartment set up like a scenario from the movie Home Alone. Vince slunk inside and I after him. This apartment was a dump. There was only one room with a separate square bathroom, carved out of one corner of the large room. The single grimy window looked out on the squalor below, and the artificial lights gave off a sickly green glow through the filthy panes. The furniture consisted of 2 foldable chairs and a foldable table. The kitchen was a sink on the right, with a 2-foot-long counter. Cockroaches that made ours look like ants ran across the floor and into holes in the walls. Other than the bugs, the place appeared deserted. I unconsciously stepped closer to Vince.
I don't think anyone's home, I whispered.
He didn't relax his stiff stance. We may not be alone. Stay near the door. He tread carefully across the floor toward the bathroom. Vince reached the bathroom and opened the door. He leaned his head in, but a moment later he pulled out and shook his head. Nothing, but that didn't stop his eyes from sweeping over the room. I stood useless by the partially open door. It was unnerving to watch my partner walk across various rugs and dilapidated floorboards. I wondered if at any moment a trap would spring, and we would both be useful only for fertilizer. The only action I could do was use my own eyes to scour the small space. The cockroaches scurried to their corners, but I noticed a few of them slipped beneath a space in the wall to the right that stood opposite the bathroom. The space should have been dark because it led beneath the wall, but instead I saw a faint light. I waved my arms above my head to catch Vince's attention. He looked to me and raised a gray eyebrow. I pointed at the wall. His eyes followed my finger, and he was in time to watch one of the bug occupants slip beneath the wall. Vince furrowed his brow and silently crept to the wall. He leaned his ear against the faded, peeling wallpaper for a moment, and then he took a step back. My shoulders slumped, sure I'd been wrong about my suspicions. Then Vince pulled his hand back and slammed it through the wall. It tore through a thin layer of wallpaper and styrofoam. A woman shrieked, and the wall opened to reveal a hidden closet. The witch from the woods, Simone, sprang from the wall. She slammed the door into Vince, scurried past him and to the door, but I tackled her. I ended up on top of her, as we both faced Vince. Get off. Let go of me, she shrieked. I clamped my hand over her mouth.
We're not going to hurt you, I told her.
She didn't believe me, and continued to thrash and pull. Vince came over and knelt in front of us. His blue eyes caught hers and she cringed. Why You're supposed to be dead. You performed the wrong hex, he explained. Yeah, you made a vampire live and now he's aging to death, I added. Simone scowled at us. Good. Anybody who works for Ruthven deserves to die. We have no affiliation with Ruthven, Vince revealed. Simone stopped her struggles and blinked at us. You don't. No, we need your help with 2 things, I spoke up. I nodded at Vince. 1, get rid of the hex on him, and 2, tell us if you know why Ruthven had your friend Hilda killed. Simone frowned. And if I don't? Our conversation was interrupted by the howl of a werewolf, and that sound was quickly followed by screams and a panic from downstairs. Vince glanced at the door, frowned, and looked down at Simone. Then we will feed you to Ruthven's werewolves. Chapter 13. Let me go. Simone yelped. She resumed her struggles to get me off her. I pressed my weight down on her and glared at Vince. Vera wanted her back to Witch's Inc., and probably alive and in one piece. If she is of no use to us, then it would be better if they killed her, Vince argued. Simone stopped her thrashing and scrutinized us. Is that it? You just want to know why Hilda was killed, she spoke up. We both looked down at her. Yeah, and to get the hex off, I reminded her. I'll do both if you get me out of the city, she offered. We promised Vera we'd take you back to Witches Inc., I told her. She shook her head. That won't work. Ruthven's too powerful in this city. He'll get at me there, But if you could get me out of here and away from him, then I'll lift the hex and tell you what I know." "Lifting the hex now would be really helpful," I insisted.
"I need at least 5 minutes to cast the anti-hex," she told me.
There came another howl, and I heard the scurry of heavy claws on the stairs down the hall. We maybe had 1 minute. I whipped my head to Vince. "I'm saying yes to her offer." Vince frowned but gave a nod.
"Very well, but stay close."
I let Simone up and took her arm. "Like on our heels," I added.
"Follow me," Vince ordered us.
He hurried to the single window and opened the lower part of the glass. Simone furrowed her brow.
"You can't get out there."
"There isn't any fire escape." "No, but the boards on the exterior may hold a body, and are wide enough to use as hand and foot grips," he explained.
"That's suicide," she argued.
He looked to her and raised an eyebrow.
"Unless you know a flying spell, we have no choice."
I raised my hand. I don't really think we want her casting any more spells. I don't want to turn into a flying carrot." Simone glared at me. "I am a perfect witch when I'm not under pressure." The howling and clawing reached our floor and scurried down the hall. The nostrils of the werewolves were loud enough I heard their snorts and sniffs. "I think this counts as pressure, so let's do as the nice former vampire tells us and get out that window." I pushed her toward the window as Vince slipped out. Though he was aged, he was at least still skinny, and the wooden boards of the building held his weight. Simone and I were both petite, and Vince led the way down with Simone above him. I swung one leg out, just as something heavy slammed itself against the door. The wood broke in half and revealed a hairy shoulder. The shoulder was replaced with the elongated face of the werewolf, and its golden eyes swept over the room until they fell on me. The werewolf snarled, and I sheepishly grinned and waved at it. It howled, and rammed its shoulder into the splintered door. The entrance buckled, and a half-dozen werewolves spilled into the tiny room. I slipped onto the siding, and scurried downward to where Vince and Simone awaited. I landed on the ground, and my feet sank in a few inches of muck. Our escape had led us to the rear of the establishment, which also happened to be near the end of the illegal underground. I heard grunts and growls above me, and tilted my head back. The werewolf hung his head out the window, and tried to squeeze his wide shoulders through the small window. The result was his getting stuck, and his companions behind him howling in rage.
"I must remember to dock their pay," a voice commented.
Our attention turned to the opposite end of the building, where stood a small, bespectacled man. I recognized him from the 9th Precinct. This was Ron Field, secretary to Ruthven and creepy man extraordinaire. His pale lips held a ghost of a smile. "Where the hell is Romero when you need him?" I wondered.
"There's no need for a policeman."
"I assure you I only want the witch," Field informed us. Vince stepped in front of our little group and scowled at our old acquaintance. "She is ours," he insisted. Field's cold eyes swept over Vince's appearance, and his thin lips curled up in a smile. "Did this ignorant witch hit you with a life hex?" Simone glared at him. "I'm not ignorant, and it was supposed to be a death hex." Field reached up with one hand and pressed his glasses against his nose. "I am afraid idle chat is not my forte. Please give me the witch, or I will be forced to hurt you."
"No," Vince replied.
"Then goodbye." Field raised his hand and it glowed like Vera's hands as she prepared magic. Beside me, Simone's eyes widened, and her voice came out as a hoarse, trembling whisper.
"Sorcerer."
I glanced between Field and her. "So what? We've seen." From Field's hand was blasted a ball of crackling energy that, while small, burned off such heat that I felt the warmth on my cheeks at 20 feet. Vince turned, wrapped his arms around both of us, and shoved us against the wall. The ball spun past us, and collided with an innocent trash can and pile of junk. The bystanders were obliterated into specks of dust, and their remains rained down on us like a thick snowfall. The thick snow ashes limited our view to only a few yards. We heard a crunching through the thick snowfall and Field emerged close at hand. He knocked Vince on the side of his face, and Vince flew across the alley and hit his back against the wall of the neighboring building. He made a terrible wheezing sound as the air was forced from his lungs, and I heard bones crack beneath the impact. Field shoved me hard enough against the bar building to knock the breath from me, and he grabbed Simone by the collar. He lifted her off the ground and carried her by his side back from where he'd come. "Help! Help me!" Simone screamed as she squirmed and kicked in his grasp. Through my daze I saw Vince stand shakily to his feet. His teeth ground together and his face was pale, but he stumbled forward behind Field and Simone. He held his ring in front of him. The ring glowed with its unnatural light, and from the stone came a net that shot out and wrapped around Simone. I heard a hissing noise when the net landed on Field's arm and hand. Smoke rose from his skin as the net melted into his body. He turned and showed his face was as calm as usual, but his eyes burned with hatred for Vince and the light from his ring. "I have no instructions to kill you at this time, Vincent. Do not interfere, or I may be forced to disobey my master." Field grabbed the net with his free hand and tore it off himself and Simone. It fell to the ground and vanished.
"Is that all you can do?"
Simone screeched at Vince. "Do away with me, but I will guarantee your boss will never see you again," Vince challenged him. He pulled his arm back, and when he flung it forward, another larger net flew out of the ring and landed on the pair, this time covering them both completely. Steam arose from Field's entire body, and the smell of burning flesh permeated the alley. I gasped and clapped my hand over my nose. Field raised his free hand and his light cut through Vince's net. It fell, and again disappeared. I glanced to Vince and noticed he swayed and stumbled backward. His hair had grayed more and he gasped for breath. Vera's warning echoed in my head: a human couldn't wield our rings without dying. "Then stop!" I yelled at him. Field accepted Vince's challenge when he tossed Simone into a nearby trash can where her rear stuck tight in the mouth. He held his hands one over the other with 6 inches between them, and in the space between them there arose a new crackling ball of energy. Spikes slid out of the surface, and Field spread his hands farther to accommodate their needed space. All their tips pointed at Vince, and they slowly slid closer toward him. My eyes widened when I realized Field meant to launch them at Vince. My heaving, gasping partner was barely able to stand, much less dodge so many spikes. A slow, wicked grin slid onto Field's face. "Farewell." He quickly pulled apart his hands and the spikes sprang from the ball. I pushed off the wall and launched myself at Vince. I jumped in front of him with my face toward the oncoming spikes, and instinctively I flung up my arms in front of me and slammed my eyes shut. A bright light burst through my eyelids, and the expected piercings and unbearable pain never came. I dared open one eye, and saw a wall of light in front of me. The light originated from my ring, held out in front of me. I blinked and lowered my ring hand. The barrier lowered with me. "Cool," I whispered. A hand clapped onto my shoulder, and I turned to see Vince's haggard, wrinkled face staring into mine. He looked 80 now, and his face was scrunched up in pain. Vince nodded at my barrier. "Bring it down," he hissed. I snorted.
"And let us both die."
I counted.
"Your hands," he rasped.
I glanced down at my hands and noticed they were aged 20 years. The ring's energy drained my life too. "You have a quick learner with the ring's power, but your bodies won't last long," Field spoke up. He formed another ball of spikes between his hands. Vince tried to pull me behind him, but his strength failed him. I pushed him behind me, and raised my ring hand and with it the barrier. This time I felt my life energy sapped from my body, but Field didn't let me take a break. He created a ball twice the size as the original, and flung the spikes at me. They sped across the short distance in the alley, and slammed into my barrier. Each pound sapped a little more energy from me, as the barrier tried to keep itself alive by killing me. Oh hell no. I was not going to die in this crummy alley, with magical spikes impaled in my shriveled body. I set my jaw in a tight scowl, and clasped my right hand in my ring hand. My barrier walls thickened, and I stifled a cry from my throat as the transfer of life changed from a slow slide to a hard, fast, painful yank. I ground my teeth together, leaned on my barrier, and marched forward. The spikes pounded in my barrier, but none penetrated the thick walls. On the other side of the barrier, Field's eyes widened, and he took a step back as though to flee.
"Oh no you don't, asshole,"
I yelled at him. I pushed through the remaining spikes and charged him. He lifted his glowing hands to perform some other pain-in-the-ass trick, but I slid up to him and pulled back both my hands as though I held a bat. The barrier mimicked my movements when it pulled back, and formed itself into the baseball equipment, with my hands wrapped around the handle. I swung and the bat connected with the side of Field's face. I expected the slam to knock him to the ground. What I got was a home run. Field flew backward down the alley, and into the next block. Or maybe the block after that. He disappeared from my sight, and I heard a crash from far away.
"And don't come back," I wheezed.
I set the top of my bat on the ground, but the light disappeared and I tumbled to the mucky alley floor. I tried to get up but my strength failed me. Vince's face appeared over mine, and he lifted my upper body so my shoulder leaned against his chest.
"You should not have done that," he whispered.
I smiled up at him. "You're welcome." A coughing fit overcame me, and when it finished I felt as weak as a lamb. I was also tired, so very tired. My eyes wouldn't stay open. "Guess I overdid it," I whispered. "You were very foolish," he agreed. I managed a weak chuckle, and I raised one hand and cupped his wrinkled old cheek. "Did I ever mention that I don't really hate you?" A few loose tears slipped from his eyes, and he clasped his hand in mine.
"No, but I will make a note of it," he promised.
There came a crash and a tumble, and in a moment I noticed Simone over Vince's shoulder. I noticed her lips moved fast but I heard no sound. Maybe it was because the world was fading to black. Everything faded to dull-colored hues and was quiet. I just wanted to rest. I couldn't keep my eyes open. Over me, Vince's eyes widened. I felt him shake me, but I couldn't move my mouth to reply. I couldn't move anything. There was just this soft warmth and a strange light through my closed eyes.
Liz.
Chapter 14. My eyes shot open, and my head rolled so that I looked to my side. The grimy scenery of the alley was gone, replaced by the grimy scenery of an unknown sewer culvert. The slippery molding walls flew by at superhuman speed, and beneath me was a familiar pair of arms. I looked up and found myself staring into Vince's face. His lips were pressed to thin lines and his face was pale. Gone were the wrinkles and all the gray hairs, but a few streaks along his temple. He carried me in his arms and we sped through the culvert. My lips felt parched and my limbs were stiff. "Vince," I croaked. Vince didn't look down at me, and his voice was a ghost of a whisper.
"Quiet," he replied.
I heard a soft whooshing noise to his right and in front of me. My eyes fell on Simone, who rode beside us on a spindly worn broom. She sat low on the wooden wreck and faced straight ahead. More sounds caught my attention, and these came from behind. I turned my head, and could just barely look over Vince's arm. Even in the blackness of the tunnel, I could make out dark shapes as they splashed through and jumped over puddles that Vince silently flitted through, and Simone flew over. The dark shapes had yellow eyes and sharp teeth, and every now and again they let out horrible grunts and growls. Werewolves, and they gained on us.
"We're not losing them,"
Simone shouted at us. Vince slid to a stop and turned around. Simone pulled a U-turn a couple of yards ahead, and flew back to us.
"What are you doing?" she shrieked.
"Take her." Vince handed me off to Simone, and she unwillingly cradled me atop her broom and against herself.
"What?
Why?" My eyes widened when Vince raised his ring hand. "No," I hoarsely protested.
"You're not strong enough yet.
It could kill you," Simone also argued. Vince looked straight ahead and narrowed his head.
"That doesn't matter anymore," he answered.
A faint light erupted from his ring, and the familiar bubble of shining crystal spears burst from the surface. The culvert glowed with the unnatural light, and the dark creatures of the sewers scrambled away from its brilliance. The spears flew from the bubble, and across the 50-yard distance into our pursuers. The werewolves howled and fell to the floor writhing in pain. The light from Vince's ring disappeared, and the tunnel returned to its natural darkened state. Vince turned back to us and took me from Simone. We rushed down the tunnel once more, and in a few minutes there came a light at the end. Freedom was granted when we reached a grate like that under the bridge, and Vince returned me to Simone while he used his strength to tear the metal from the mouth and fling the grate 10 yards beyond the opening. He took me back, and the three of us hurried into the light of the clear night sky. The culvert we exited came out somewhere on the outskirts of the city. Behind us lay the lights of the metropolis, and in front of us lay the long, uninterrupted shadows of the countryside. Simone stepped off her broom and stood in front of us while Vince set me down on the ground so my back lay on a nearby rock. "Mind telling me what happened?" I choked out. "The witch returned my unlife and saved yours," he explained.
"And just barely," Simone spoke up.
"A few more seconds, and you would have been able to say hello to Hilda for me. You're just lucky I was there to save your soul." I looked past Vince and glared at her. The anger that welled up inside me returned some of my energy to me. "If you wouldn't have put the hex on us in the first place, a lot of this wouldn't have happened," I shot back. Simone frowned. "You'd be paranoid too, if Ruthven was after you." Vince stood and turned to her. "We made an agreement. You have lifted your hex, and we have led you from the city. Why was Hilda killed?" Simone rubbed her chin, and her eyes flickered between us. "I suppose you've held up your part, but I can't quite tell you why Hilda was killed because I don't really know myself." "What?" I yelled. Vince held up his hand to me and trained his eyes on Simone.
"Then why was Ruthven after you?"
He questioned her. "Because he wanted to know where Hilda hid something. When I asked what it was she hid, all she gave me was this." Simone reached into her pocket and pulled out a slip of paper. She handed it over to Vince, who unfolded it. I struggled to see what he held, but my legs wouldn't let me stand.
"What is it?"
I asked him. He shocked me when he obliged by kneeling at my side and holding out the paper to reveal a folded half of a Queen of Hearts. "A card?" I wondered. Simone gave a nod. She said she gave the other half to another friend, and if I ever wanted to find her, I'd have to consult a medium. "A medium what?" I asked her. Simone rolled her eyes. "A medium is one who consults the dead. Whoever has the other piece is dead." I glanced at Vince. "Tim," I suggested to him. He pursed his lips and pocketed the clue. "We must hope not, or Ruthven will have a hold of it," he pointed out. "If that's all you need me from, then I better get going," Simone spoke up.
"It's a long ride to where I have to go. What if we need to find you again?"
I asked her. She shrugged.
"I don't have anything else to give you, so it doesn't matter.
Anyway, good luck on finding the other half. Oh, and if you see Ruthven, give him a black eye for me, will you? He deserves more for killing Hilda, but I'm not keeping my fingers crossed that anyone can do any more than that to him." "We will try our best," Vince promised. "Good." Simone turned away from us and flew down the lonely road toward the horizon. I turned my attention to Vince and lowered my voice.
"You think we should stop her?"
He shook his head. "No. She is telling the truth." I sighed and nodded at his pocket.
"So through all this trouble, that's all we have to go on? A piece of a card?"
"If it were easy, Ruthven would have solved the puzzle," he pointed out. I shifted and winced when my aching body protested the movement. "I wouldn't call anything we've done these last few nights easy. How'd we get out of that underground anyway?" "There was a nearby manhole in the alley, and we escaped through there. Field ordered his werewolves to follow, and you saw them dispatched by me," he explained. My jaw dropped to the ground.
"That Field guy's still alive?"
Vince nodded.
"Very much so."
I glared down at my ring. This thing isn't very good against the real tough guys, is it? You were near death, and were fortunate your powers knocked him back as far as you did, Vince argued. I slyly grinned at him.
It was a good swing though, wasn't it?
Vince surprised me when sat beside me. His red eyes swept over my face with unnerving seriousness. What did I do now? You risked your life to save me, he pointed out. I turned away to hide my blushing cheeks and shrugged. You did the same for me at Hilda's place, I reminded him. Thank you. I whipped my head back to him and blinked. He stared back with a softness to his eyes I'd never seen before. Did you just thank me again? Vince straightened and turned away. But it was very unwise of you to use your ring, while in such a weakened position. I snorted. I figured if this old man was going to get himself killed trying to save me, I could at least do the same for him. My eyes flickered to his temples, and I reached up and brushed my hand against the remaining gray hairs. Vince winced and turned to me with a snarl. I grinned back at him. You should keep this new look. It makes you look more dashing. Vince raised an eyebrow, but the corners of his mouth twitched upward. I am stuck with the color, but I am glad to hear it doesn't affect my features too greatly. Yeah, it makes you look like a hero instead of a brooding vampire. Speaking of brooding, you think Ruthven's pretty mad at us right now? I wondered. Perhaps, but he is a patient man, and he won't allow anger to cloud his judgment, Vince told me.
So we should find out what's in that card pretty quick.
I guessed.
Yes, but after a rest, Vince replied.
And seeing Bat. He's probably pretty worried about us, I added.
No doubt, Vince agreed.
He stood and I tried to follow suit, but my legs felt like jello and I lowered myself back to the ground.
How far is it to the car?
I asked him. Roughly 15 miles. I cringed.
This night just got a lot longer, I mused.
Vince stooped and scooped me into his arms. I hid my blushing in my fury.
Put me down.
You know I don't like this. I would rather not turn to dust at the coming sunrise, waiting for your strength to return, he commented. I paused in my usual hatred pronouncement, as I recalled what I'd said to him earlier. I'm really angry at you. I rephrased. Vince grinned. I will risk it. He sped off down the lane to our left, and the city lights and countryside flew by. I scowled at him, but on the inside I felt a warm glow flow through me. I would only admit to myself that Vince and I had a truce of sorts now. With the clue in Vince's pocket and strength back in our, well, at least his body, I felt like we could take on the whole supernatural world. I was ready for our next adventure, as we dove into the supernatural world of medium-rare seances and ghastly ghouls.